Somewhere in New York on a slow grey morning in the autumn of 1895, a young woman is sitting at the edge of a tall window watching the city wake up beneath a layer of cool, soft fog. The avenue below is still mostly empty. A milk wagon turns a corner. A lamplighter is finishing his last few rounds, lifting a long brass pole to coax each gas flame into a pale, drowsy sleep. The smell of coal smoke drifts up from the kitchen far below. Somewhere down the hall, a clock is ticking quietly to itself, the way clocks did in those years, with patient brass weights and a low, even breath. The young woman is not in any kind of hurry. The day will come for her eventually. There will be calling cards to answer, a new gown to be fitted, a long afternoon of practice posture and careful conversation. But for these few minutes, the house is hers, and the city is hers, and the morning is a soft grey pause that no one has yet asked her to perform inside of. She rests her cheek against the cold pane of the window, and closes her eyes, just for a moment, and listens to the small, ordinary sounds of a world that is about to ask everything of her. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Let us stay for a while in those houses, because the houses are where the story begins. If you walked the length of Fifth Avenue in those years, in the last decade or so before the new century, you would have passed an extraordinary string of mansions. They stood shoulder to shoulder along the eastern side of Central Park, each one a little more elaborate than the last, each one designed to be looked at as much as lived in. Carved limestone faces, iron gates worked into vines and flowers, tall windows hung with deep red curtains that were drawn back during the day so that passers-by could glimpse a chandelier, a marble stair, a glimpse of a painting on a far wall. The houses were a kind of slow, quiet announcement. They said, "Here we are. We have arrived." The families who lived inside them had names that came from railroads, from steel, from copper, from oil, from sugar, from the long patient business of moving things across a young country. Vanderbilt, Astor, Belmont, Gwelle, Whitney, Hearst. Names that, 50 years earlier, had meant almost nothing to the older drawing rooms of Europe, and now meant a great deal indeed. The fortunes were enormous, the kind of fortunes that seem almost unreal when you read about them later, the kind of money that is no longer counted in dollars but in entire industries. Inside those houses, mornings began slowly. A maid would rise long before anyone else and lay a fire in the family rooms, kneeling on a hearthrug with a small brass scuttle of coal, working quietly so as not to wake the household above. The fires would catch, and warmth would gather slowly in the corners of the room, and soon the smell of warm milk and good coffee would begin to drift up the back stairs from the kitchen. A housekeeper would unlock the linen press. A footman would polish a doorknob. A long, hushed routine would begin, the kind of routine that ran a great house the way wind runs a clock. Far above the working rooms in the upper floors of those mansions, the daughters of the family slept on. They were not woken by alarms. They were woken by a soft tap on the door, by a maid drawing back a curtain just enough to let a band of pale light fall across the foot of the bed. There was no rush to anything. The day was a long, slow shape that would be filled in carefully by other people. A bath would be drawn. A dress would be laid out across a chair. A small tray of tea and toast would be brought up on a polished cart with a single flower in a slim glass vase. The bedrooms themselves were their own quiet worlds, walls papered in pale silk, painted with little garlands of roses or violets, depending on the daughter's preference. A vanity table by the window, with silver-backed brushes laid out in a careful row, and small cut-glass bottles of cologne, and a little porcelain dish for hairpins. A writing desk, often unused, except for the answering of invitations. A shelf of books that had been chosen for their bindings as much as for their words. A canopy bed, hung with cream-coloured linen, with a small embroidered pillow that someone, an aunt perhaps, had stitched as a christening gift years before. The girl who lived in such a room was being prepared, even in her sleep, for a particular kind of life. She'd grown up surrounded by the soft language of preparation. Lessons in the morning, French and German with a tutor on 3 days of the week, music in the afternoon, dancing on Saturdays with a small ensemble of cousins and family friends in a long mirrored ballroom on the 3rd floor, drawing, a little watercolour, the history of European royal houses taught with the same care that other children were taught arithmetic. Every skill was a thread, and every thread was being woven into the same garment, and the name of that garment was a future marriage. Outside the houses, the city moved in its own rhythms. In the early morning, before the carriages began to roll, the avenue belonged to delivery wagons and street sweepers and the low whistles of the men who lit and tended the gas lamps. By mid-morning, the carriages would begin to appear, glossy black broughams with glossy black horses, taking ladies on calls and merchants to offices and children to lessons. By afternoon, the avenue was a slow, pleasant parade, hats nodding to hats, gloved hands lifted in greeting, conversations carried out in the brief moments of one carriage passing another. The houses watched all of this from behind their tall windows. They were never quite still. A curtain would shift. A face would appear at an upstairs window for a moment and then withdraw. A footman would step out to take in a parcel. The houses had eyes, and the eyes belonged to mothers mostly, who were watching the avenue the way a chess player watches a board. Who was visiting whom? Who had not been seen in some time? Who was wearing a new fur? Who had a new carriage? Who, importantly, had a daughter of marriageable age and where, even more importantly, she might be sent? The mothers, for their part, were not unkind women. Most of them, anyway. They had been raised in the same expectations they were now passing on. They had married for the same reasons. They had been beautiful at 18 and clever at 22 and confident at 30, and now, at 40 or 45, they had learned the rules of the world they lived in and were intent on making sure their daughters mastered them as well. They believed they were doing the right thing. They believed they were preparing their daughters for safety. And in their world, safety meant a name, and a name meant a marriage, and a good marriage meant a title, and a title, increasingly, meant Europe. This last belief is the one that sets our story in motion. Because somewhere along the way, in those years between the end of the American Civil War and the beginning of the new century, an idea had taken shape in the drawing rooms of New York and Newport and Philadelphia. The idea was simple. American money was new, European titles were old, and the two might, with the right kind of arrangement, be persuaded to meet in the middle. We will come back to the daughters again and again, because they are the heart of this. But for now, let us stay in the houses, with the slow morning routines, the maids on their stairs, the fires being laid, the soft sound of someone playing scales on a piano in a far room. Let us let the day arrive at its own pace. Let us notice the small things, the way the light falls on a polished banister, the way the smell of coffee threads itself up the stairs and into the bedrooms, the way a young woman, half awake, stretches her arms beneath a soft coverlet and listens, without quite knowing it, to the sounds of a household preparing her for a future that someone else has already chosen. There is no hurry yet. The day is long, the century is turning, the story is patient. Outside, the fog begins to lift. A pale sun rises over the rooftops. The avenue slowly fills with the gentle noise of an ordinary morning. Somewhere, a young woman closes her eyes again and lets the world come to her in its own time. We will follow her there. Far up the avenue, in another house, another daughter is sitting up in bed, taking her first sip of tea. The cup is thin porcelain, almost translucent, and the tea inside is the colour of a winter pond at sunset. She holds it with both hands, the way she has been taught not to because no one is watching, and because the warmth feels good against her palms. Through her window she can see the tops of the trees in the park, just beginning to turn. The leaves are going gold at the edges. The morning smells of coal smoke and damp leaves, the scent of a city sliding into autumn. She's 17. She's to be presented this winter. She knows this in the same way she knows her own name. She has been told, kindly, again and again, what is expected of her, and she has rehearsed the small motions of presentation until they no longer feel like motions at all. The right curtsy, the correct way to enter a room, the placement of one's hands when seated, the small, careful smile that says yes without saying anything in particular. She has been measured for 3 new dresses already, and there will be more. Her dancing master has come twice a week since she was 12. She speaks French with a clean Parisian accent, German with a slow, careful one, and a little Italian that her music teacher insisted on, mostly for the sake of the lyrics in her songs. None of this feels strange to her, because none of it has ever been anything else. She does not think of it as preparation exactly, the way one might think of preparation for an exam. She thinks of it as growing up. Other people learn to milk cows or to add columns of figures or to ride a horse over rough country. She's learned to enter a room. It is, she has been gently and repeatedly assured, an art. Down the hall, her mother is also already awake. Her mother is almost always already awake. She's sitting at her desk in a dressing gown of pale grey silk, going through a stack of cards. The cards are invitations mostly. Some are letters from cousins, some are quietly important. There is one from a friend who has just returned from a long stay in London. The friend has news. The friend has heard things. The friend, in her careful and well-mannered way, has begun to suggest possibilities. The mother reads the letter twice. She sets it down. She picks up a pen. She does not write anything yet. She sits for a long moment, looking out the window at the same trees her daughter is looking at, and she allows herself, just briefly, to remember her own youth, her own season, her own slow walk into the long arrangement of a life. The memory is not unhappy, it is simply present. She acknowledges it, the way one might acknowledge an old friend across a crowded room, and then she returns to the letter and begins, in her steady, looping handwriting, to write a reply. The household moves around them both. The fires have caught, the kitchen is warm, the bread has been delivered, the day has begun, properly. The way days began in those houses on that avenue, slowly, gently, with the kind of unhurried routine that depended on a great many other people working very quietly in the background. We will leave them there for now, the mother and the daughter, in their separate rooms in their tall house, both looking out at the same trees, both held inside the same long current of expectation. The current will carry them forward. There is no fighting it, and at this hour of the morning there is no need to. The current is warm, it feels in fact almost like ease. Outside the fog lifts a little more, a horse and carriage pass below. A bell rings softly somewhere down the street. The houses stand watching, as they always do, full of small private worlds, full of slow private mornings, full of daughters who are about to step out into a world that has been waiting for them for a very long time. The story is patient, sleep is patient, we have time. Let us drift for a while into the smaller rooms of the house, down a half-flight of stairs from the daughters' bedrooms, past a long landing with a velvet bench and a tall vase of dried hydrangeas. There is a little sitting room that the women of the house tend to use in the late mornings. It is not the formal drawing room. The formal drawing room is downstairs, kept ready for callers, with its silk-upholstered chairs and its careful arrangement of small tables. The little upstairs sitting room is something else. It is for the family. It has a window that faces east, and at this hour the light comes in across the carpet in long warm bars. There is a writing desk in one corner, with a green leather top worn smooth by many years of resting forearms. There is a sofa with a faded pattern of small blue flowers, the kind of fabric that was fashionable 40 years earlier and has stayed in the room because no one has ever quite decided to replace it. There is a low table in front of the sofa, with a silver tray on it, and on the tray a small silver bell, and a porcelain inkwell and a stack of folded handkerchiefs that someone has been embroidering with a single careful initial. The mother sometimes does her morning correspondence here, when the light is good. The daughters sometimes practice their French here, reading aloud to each other from small leather-bound editions of stories they already know. The grandmother, when she's staying in the house, sits in the corner armchair with her knitting and watches the light move slowly across the carpet, and remembers, in her own quiet way, the houses she grew up in, 2 generations back, in a different part of the city, when the avenue itself was nothing but pasture and the gas lamps had not yet been invented. There is a small clock on the mantelpiece in this room. It chimes only on the hour and very softly, because the family has agreed that they do not want to be reminded of time too often when they are sitting together. The clock has a brass face and Roman numerals and a little gilt key that hangs on a hook beside it, used once a week by the housekeeper to wind it. The clock has been in the house since the house was built. It will remain in the house long after the family who built the house has moved out, and it will be there, still ticking softly, when the rooms have been turned into something else entirely. Clocks have a way of outlasting the people who buy them. For now, though, it is only a quiet companion to the small movements of the morning. The mother lifts her pen and writes a sentence and pauses and writes another. The grandmother turns her knitting and counts a row. The light shifts slightly as a cloud passes the sun. Somewhere downstairs a door closes. Somewhere down the hall a maid is humming faintly to herself as she folds linen. These rooms are the soft inside of the world. They are the rooms the avenue does not see. They are where the work of being a family is actually done, in long quiet stretches of light and small precise movements. The drawing rooms downstairs with their silk and their gilt are the public face. The little upstairs sitting room is the private one, and this is true of every house along the avenue. Each grand facade with its carved limestone and its iron gates conceals, somewhere up a half flight of stairs, a small room with a faded sofa and a clock that chimes too softly, and a writing desk with a green leather top worn smooth by many quiet hours. It is good to know that. It is good to know that even inside the great houses, with all their announcements of arrival, there were these small private rooms where the daughters and mothers and grandmothers gathered to be ordinary with each other. It is good to know that the morning light came in across a carpet in long warm bars, the same way morning light has been coming in across carpets in any number of rooms for a very long time. We will leave that room as it is. We do not have to do anything in it. The mother will finish her letter, the grandmother will finish her row, the daughter somewhere upstairs will finish her tea. The day will gather itself, gently, around all of them, and carry them forward into whatever it has decided to be. There is, on the wall of that little sitting room, a small painting. It is not a famous painting. It is not by anyone you would have heard of. It shows a country house in summer, with a low stone wall in the foreground, and a long lawn rolling away behind it, and at the very far end of the lawn, almost too small to see, a single figure in white, walking with a small dog at her heels. The mother of the house bought the painting many years ago, on a trip to Europe with her own mother, and she liked it because it was peaceful, and because the figure in white looked from a distance, the way she'd imagined herself looking when she was a little girl, reading stories about English country houses. She did not know, when she bought the painting and brought it home and hung it on the wall of the little upstairs sitting room, that she was hanging a picture of her own daughter's future. She did not know that 20 years later, her own daughter would be the figure in white, walking on a long lawn behind a low stone wall in a country far from this room, in a house she had not yet imagined, with a small dog at her heels. The painting is not a prophecy. The painting is just a painting. But sometimes, when the daughters were younger and were taken into the room to sit with their grandmother while she knitted, they would look up at the painting and stare for a long time at the small figure in white at the far end of the lawn, and they would feel something they could not have named. We will let them stare. We will not name it for them either. The painting hangs on the wall. The light moves across the carpet. The clock chimes, very softly, the half hour. Outside, the avenue goes on with its business, full of carriages and footmen and the slow ordinary commerce of an autumn morning in 1895. Inside, the family rooms hold their warmth. Inside, the daughters drink their tea. Inside, the morning unfolds at the speed of patience. The story is patient, the story has time. To understand how the daughters came to be sent so far from those tall houses, we have to walk back a little, into the country itself, into the long American century that produced them. We do not have to go far, a generation, perhaps two, just enough to feel the shape of it. The fortunes that filled those mansions had not always been there. Most of them were at most 50 years old. Some were younger. The grandfather who had built a railroad line was often still alive, in some upstairs room of a Newport cottage, telling his great-grandchildren stories about the year the rails first reached a particular town in the middle of Pennsylvania. The father who had bought up the right copper mines, or the right oil leases, or the right shares in a steel mill, was often still walking down to his office every morning, dressed in a black coat, carrying a leather case of papers, doing the daily work of keeping a fortune alive. The work was real. That is the part that the later stories sometimes forget. These were not idle people. They had built their fortunes in a particular way, in a particular country, at a particular moment, when a continent was being knit together with iron and steam and credit. They had taken risks. They had worked through panics and recoveries. They had hired men and built towns and signed contracts and stood in long smoky rooms with other men in black coats and argued for hours about freight rates and bond yields and tariffs. They had earned what they had, and they had earned it on a scale the world had never quite seen before. But money once made asks to be placed somewhere, and in America in those years it was not always clear where it should go. The older drawing rooms of New York were polite about new money. They were polite the way a careful host is polite to a guest who has wandered in by accident. They smiled. They served tea. They did not, however, invite that guest back. There was a list, kept in the head of one particular hostess on Fifth Avenue, of the people who counted, and the list had 400 names on it. because 400 was the number of people who could fit comfortably in her ballroom. If your name was on the list, you were of the world. If it was not, you were merely rich. This was the nature of old money in the older American cities. It was not always wealthier than the new money. Often, in fact, it was poorer. But it had been there longer. It had a memory of itself. It had streets named after its grandfathers, and pews in old churches, and silver in cabinets that had been polished by the same family of housekeepers for 60 years. It moved slowly, and married carefully, and looked, with quiet alarm, at the new mansions going up along the avenue, at the new yachts in Newport Harbour, at the new daughters being trained like racehorses to enter the season. The new money looked back. The new money saw the old drawing rooms and felt, somewhere deep beneath all the practical confidence of building railroads and steel mills, a small persistent wish to be invited in. Not because there was anything inside those drawing rooms that the new money did not already have, in greater quantity, in newer fabric, in fresher paint. But because being invited in would have meant something. It would have meant arrival. It would have meant a story with a settled ending. The story, however, did not have a settled ending. The 400 remained polite and remained closed. This is where Europe entered. Not all at once, not as a plan, just as a slowly spreading idea. Because if the older drawing rooms of America were not going to open their doors to the new American fortunes, there was, after all, another set of older drawing rooms, considerably older, considerably more storied, on the other side of an ocean. And those drawing rooms were increasingly in need of a particular kind of help. The European nobility in those decades was in a quiet sort of trouble. The trouble was not dramatic, it was financial, it was structural. It was the slow, unhappy result of the 19th century arriving in countries that had been built around an older arrangement of land and tenants and inherited income. The agricultural depression of the 1870s and 1880s had hollowed out estates that had supported families for centuries. Rents had fallen, tenants had emigrated. Wheat from the American prairies, shipped cheaply across the Atlantic, had undercut the careful old crops of English and Irish and French farmland. The great houses still stood, but the income that had heated them and staffed them and roofed them was no longer reliable. A duke in those years might still own 30,000 acres and a castle, and a London townhouse and a hunting lodge and a private chapel. He might also be, quietly, in considerable debt. He might be looking at a leaking roof and a tax bill and a son at school whose fees had not been paid, and he might be wondering in the long evenings where the next stretch of money was going to come from. He could, of course, sell some land. Many of them did. He could sell a painting, or a piece of jewellery, or a manuscript, or a small holding in some far county. But these were one-time solutions. They eased the pressure of a season. They did not solve the long shape of the problem. The long shape of the problem was that the world had changed under his feet. Land, which had been the source of all his family's wealth for 600 years, no longer paid the way it once had, and the law of his own family, the long entail that bound the estate together and prevented him from breaking it up, kept him from making the kind of dramatic adjustments a more recent fortune might have managed. He was, in effect, the careful steward of a beautiful leaking ship. What he needed, if we are to be honest about it, was an infusion, something that would close the gap, something that would let him repair the roof and pay the staff and keep the chapel standing and send his son back to school and continue to be, in the eyes of his neighbours and his county and his country, the person his name said he was. What he had in great supply was the name itself, a title that went back in some cases to a king who had handed it out in a tent on a battlefield in the 14th century, a coat of arms quartered with the arms of 3 other ancient houses, a right to a particular pew in a particular cathedral, or a particular seat in a particular legislative chamber, a name that carried, even in the quietest mention, a kind of slow weight. Across the ocean, in the houses on the avenue, the new American money had the opposite portfolio. It had no name worth speaking of in those older terms, but it had cash, and cash was precisely what the older houses lacked. So a market began to form, not in the way markets usually form, with stalls and prices and goods openly displayed. This one formed quietly, in the language of mothers writing letters to other mothers, and in the conversations of older women in deep chairs at certain hotels in London and Paris and Newport. There was a lady such and such who had recently been to America and seen the most charming young woman in Boston. There was a Comte de Souche and such whose family seat needed a new roof, and whose son was, by all accounts, presentable. There was a duke, considerably less than presentable, but with a remarkable name, whose mother had been quietly inquiring whether anyone knew of an American family of suitable means. It was in its way the slow opening of a long door. For the American mothers, the door was a kind of revelation. Here, at last, was a route into a story with a settled ending. Their daughters could not be added to the list of 400, perhaps, because the list of 400 had its own internal arithmetic. But their daughters could be added to a much older list. They could become countesses. They could become duchesses. They could walk into rooms in London and have their names announced in a way that made every head turn, including the heads of the very women who, in New York, would not have invited them to tea. It was an extraordinary swap when you looked at it carefully. The American mother gave up a daughter, in some practical sense, sending her 3,000 miles across an ocean to a country whose weather she had only read about. She gave up the easy comfort of having her child within an afternoon's carriage ride. She gave up grandchildren who would speak her own accent. In exchange, she received a title, and the title settled, in some final way, the question of whether her family had arrived. The Duke, on his side, gave up the older idea that titles were not for sale. He gave up the comfort of being able to think that his name was beyond the reach of money. He gave up, often, the prospect of a marriage made within his own circle, with a young woman raised in the same country houses he had been raised in. In exchange, he received, in the form of a settlement carefully negotiated by lawyers in 2 languages, the precise number of pounds he needed to fix the roof, pay the staff, redeem the mortgage, and continue to be the person his name said he was. The young woman, of course, gave up rather more. We will come to that. We are not in any hurry tonight. For now, let us stay with the slow arrangement itself, with the way the door opened, with the soft, almost domestic language in which the whole transaction was conducted. There were no auctions. There were no public lists of prices. There were only mothers in drawing rooms with cups of tea, comparing notes. There were only fathers in offices with neat columns of figures. There were only older women in hotel lounges making introductions, lifting an eyebrow over a glass of sherry, suggesting that perhaps a particular family in New York might be interested in meeting a particular family in Buckinghamshire. The whole machinery was so quiet that even now, more than 100 years later, it can be hard to see clearly. It moved by hint and implication. It moved by the subtle adjustment of a guest list, by the careful seating at a dinner, by the inviting of a young man to a Newport regatta, by the inviting of a young woman to a London ball. It worked because everyone involved understood the language. The young women themselves understood it, even when they were not told directly. They had grown up watching their mothers run smaller versions of the same arrangement. They had seen older sisters and older cousins drift, season by season, into engagements with men whose names sat heavily in the announcements. The newspapers helped. The newspapers loved the story because the story was easy to tell and pleasant to print. A photograph of a beautiful young American in a white gown beside a tall, slightly bored European in a tailcoat. A few lines about the wedding gift list, the size of the trousseau, the nature of the honeymoon. A short paragraph about the bride's mother, the bride's home in New York, the bride's accomplishments at her finishing school. The newspapers gave the story a glow, and the glow, in its turn, encouraged more families to consider whether their own daughters might, in time, find a similar match. So the trickle became a stream, and the stream by the 1890s became a fairly steady river. In all, in the years between the late 1860s and the beginning of the First World War, several hundred American daughters made the journey. Different sources count them differently depending on what counts as a noble title and what counts as a finished marriage, but the figure is something on the order of 450. 450 young women, packed into trunks and shipped across an ocean, into houses with names like Blenheim and Dunrobin and Curramore and Marlborough, into a way of life that none of them had been born to, and into a story that none of them had quite written for themselves. 450 is a number worth pausing on. It is small enough that one could, in principle, learn each name. It is large enough that it formed a phenomenon. It is the kind of number that fills a steamer over many crossings, that fills a pew in a cathedral over many weddings, that fills the long, slow column inches of a society page over a generation. It is also the kind of number that has somewhere within it a great deal of unspoken life. Each of those 450 was a particular young woman with a particular voice, a particular handwriting, a particular set of small habits, a particular favourite colour, a particular way of laughing when she thought no one was listening. Each had grown up in a particular tall house on a particular avenue in a particular American city, with a particular view from a particular bedroom window, looking at a particular set of trees as they turned each autumn. We do not have to know all of them tonight. We do not have to know any of them, in fact, in the way the newspapers knew them. We can simply hold the number, gently, the way one holds a small bird, and let it sit there in the soft air of the story. 450. 450 different girls in 450 different bedrooms, looking at 450 different sets of trees, while 450 different mothers in 450 other rooms sat at 450 quiet desks and answered the morning's letters. Outside, the day moves on, carriages roll, bells ring. Somewhere a kettle is being lifted from a stove. Somewhere a maid is shaking out a fresh tablecloth across a long polished table. Somewhere a butler is checking the wine cellar for a particular vintage, a vintage that is being saved, as it happens, for an engagement dinner that has not yet been formally announced. The arrangement is patient. The river runs gently. The story is in no hurry. We have time. It is worth pausing here, in the middle of the slow arrangement, to think for a moment about the lawyers. The lawyers are not romantic figures, but they were the engine of the whole thing, and their offices were the rooms where the language of love and the language of money met each other most plainly. A lawyer in those years, working on what was politely called a marriage settlement, would sit in an office somewhere in Lower Manhattan, or somewhere in the City of London, with a roll-top desk and a green-shaded lamp, and a long cabinet of leather-bound casebooks behind him. He would have been a careful man, dressed in a careful suit with a careful watch chain across his careful waistcoat. He would have spoken in a careful voice. He would have used a particular vocabulary that had been used by lawyers in those rooms for a very long time. Trusts and entails and pin money and dower and jointure. Words that had once meant something specific in older legal traditions, and that still meant something specific now, although the specifics had shifted gently from one century to another. The lawyer's job was to translate. He had on one side of his desk the wishes of the bride's father, expressed in the language of an American businessman. He had on the other side the wishes of the groom's family, expressed in the language of an English or French solicitor. The two languages did not quite match. The American father wanted to know that his daughter would be provided for, and that his money would be invested wisely, and that his grandchildren would inherit something. The European solicitor wanted to know that the estate would receive enough cash to address its immediate needs, and that the entail would not be disturbed, and that the family's existing arrangements would not be unduly modified. The lawyer translated. He drafted. He sent letters across the ocean, sometimes by ship, later by telegram. He waited for responses. He drafted again. The drafts went back and forth for months. They acquired clauses and lost clauses and acquired them back again in slightly modified form. They were measured. They were precise. They were the kind of documents that, when finally signed, would govern the financial life of two families for 2 or 3 generations. While all of this was happening in the offices, the bride and the groom were generally elsewhere, doing other things. The bride was being fitted for her trousseau. The groom was attending to his estate, or to his regiment, or to whatever the demands of his particular life were. They might write to each other, occasionally. The letters would be polite. They would discuss the weather, or a recent visit to a mutual friend, or a piece of news that had appeared in some paper. They would not mostly discuss the negotiations being conducted in the offices, because the negotiations were not their work. The negotiations belonged to the lawyers and the fathers, and the lawyers and the fathers would, in the end, present the finished document for everyone to sign. The bride, when she signed her own portion of the document, often did so in the presence of her father and her father's lawyer, and sometimes also in the presence of an older female relative who had been brought in to provide a kind of moral witness. The signing took place very often in a small office or a small drawing room. The pen was passed. The bride wrote her name. The lawyer blotted the ink. The father, watching, would feel a small pang of something he could not quite name, because his daughter was, in that moment, a little further from being his daughter than she had been a moment before. We do not have to dwell on the pang. The story moves on. The lawyer files the document. The father returns to his office. The daughter returns to her trousseau. The arrangement continues to mature, like a long, quiet wine, in the cellar of the family's calendar, until the day of the wedding finally arrives. But it is good, perhaps, to know that the lawyers were there. it is good to know that even the most romantic version of the story, the one with the white gown and the cathedral and the bells, was sitting on top of a stack of legal documents that ran to many hundreds of pages, in many small clauses, in 2 languages, written in the careful handwriting of men in green-shaded offices on either side of an ocean. The romance and the law went together. They were not in opposition. They were, in those years, simply 2 halves of the same arrangement. And the arrangement, as we have seen, was patient. The lawyers worked slowly. The fathers were not in a hurry. The mothers were not in a hurry. The houses on the avenue were not in a hurry. The Duke in his draughty castle, with his leaking roof, was a little more in a hurry perhaps, but he had been waiting for some time already, and a few more months of waiting would not undo him. The arrangement could afford to be slow, because everyone involved understood that slowness was part of the value. A hasty marriage suggested desperation, a slow marriage suggested judgment, and judgment in those years was the most valuable of all the social currencies. So the documents drafted themselves, sentence by careful sentence, while the autumn turned into winter and the winter into spring. The trees in the park went from gold to bare to faintly green again. The mother at her writing desk filled one stack of letters and started another. The daughter in her upper bedroom wore one season's dresses and was measured for the next. The lawyers blotted their ink. The fathers signed where they were asked to sign, and the arrangement, patient and unhurried as a river, carried itself toward whatever it was going to be. We will leave the lawyers in their offices. They have a great deal of work still to do. We will move instead into the rooms where the daughters were preparing their trousseau, because those are the rooms where the small daily texture of the story lived, and it is in those rooms that we'll find our next quiet hours. It was, of course, impossible for any of this to remain entirely private. The houses on the avenue were too tall, the dresses too splendid, the weddings too photographed. By the 1890s, the American newspapers had taken hold of the phenomenon and were not inclined to let it go. If you sat down with a stack of those papers now, in some quiet corner of a library, with the light slanting in through a tall window and a green-shaded reading lamp warming the page, you would find the phenomenon discussed in a way that feels at once familiar and strange. Familiar because the language is the language of a story and stories travel. Strange because the language is also in places oddly frank. A phrase used at the time by more than one writer was the phrase dollar princess. It was meant lightly. It was used in headlines and in cartoons and in the kind of short sketches that appeared at the back of magazines. A dollar princess was an American girl who had crossed the ocean and acquired a coronet. The phrase was a wink. It admitted, without quite saying so, that the coronet had been bought and that the dollars on this side of the ocean had been, in some quiet way, the cause of the whole thing. Another phrase, more remarkable still, appeared in some of the editorial pages. The phrase compared the daughters, in the language of 19th century commerce, to a kind of national resource. There was a writer in one paper who suggested, with the tone of a man making a clever joke, that the country might consider levying an export tariff on these brides, the way one might levy a tariff on cotton, or on copper, or on iron ore. He described them, in his article, as a mineral deposit. The phrase was meant to be amusing. It was meant to puncture the sentimental tone of the wedding announcements with a colder, more practical kind of humour. The country, said the writer, was sending its best young women abroad in great numbers, and was getting in return only some old houses and some tired titles, and surely there was a fairer rate of exchange to be discussed. Now when one reads such a phrase 100 years later, in the soft light of a quiet evening, it is hard not to feel a small, slow turn somewhere beneath the ribs. The phrase is, on its face, a joke. But the joke contains an admission. The admission is that everyone involved understood at some level that the daughters were being sent, that their leaving was a matter of national accounting, that the question, if there was a question, was not whether the practice was right or wrong, but whether the price was favourable. We will not linger too long on the sharpness of that. Not tonight. Sleep is what we are after, and the press of the 1890s, for all its cleverness, can wait for us in the morning. We will simply note gently that the phrase existed, that a writer at a real newspaper, at a real desk, in a real city, sat down one afternoon and proposed in print that the country tax its own daughters on their way out. We will note that other writers replied, in other papers, sometimes agreeing and sometimes disagreeing, but mostly continuing the conversation in the same general key. We will note that no one at the time seemed especially scandalized by the comparison itself. It is, in its way, a small window onto the world the daughters were being sent into. A world that could speak with a straight face, of young women as a resource to be extracted and shipped. A world that thought of marriage, when it was being honest about it, as a kind of trade. A world that gave that trade a column in the newspaper and a place on the editorial page. Inside the houses on the avenue, the daughters read the papers. They read them the way young women had always read newspapers, with a half-distracted attention, with a fingertip following the columns, with a lingering pause at the wedding announcements and the foreign news. They saw the photographs of other young women, women they had grown up alongside, posed beside the new husbands they had acquired. They saw the descriptions of those husbands. They saw the names of the houses those husbands brought with them. They saw sometimes the small cartoon at the back of the magazine, the cartoon of the girl in white and the older man in a coronet, and the dollar sign drawn somewhere between them in the careful inky line of a cartoonist who knew his audience. They did not mostly speak of these things at breakfast. Breakfast in those houses was a quiet meal. There was tea, there was toast, there was a small dish of preserves, there was sometimes a slice of cold ham. The newspapers were folded beside the plates. A father read the financial pages, a mother read the social pages, a daughter, if she was old enough to take her meals with the family, read whatever section was given to her, often the foreign news, occasionally the literary supplement. But the daughters had eyes. They had ears. They had, even at 16 and 17, a sense of where the conversation went when they were not in the room. They knew that their own engagements would, in time, appear on the same page. They knew that the cartoonist would, in time, draw them too, in white beside an older man in a coronet, with a dollar sign somewhere between them, drawn small enough to be polite and large enough to be unmistakable. It is a strange thing to grow up reading about your own future in the newspaper, to learn the shape of the story you're about to live by reading the version of it that other people have already lived. The strangeness in those years was simply part of the air. The daughters breathed it in without quite noticing it, the way one breathes in cold smoke on a cold morning, and it became, over time, part of the way the world tasted. Now, in the slow grey hours of the night, with the world quiet outside, we can let those papers fold themselves up and rest on their breakfast tables. We can let the cartoons go back into their drawers. We can let the editorial pages settle, the way pages settle when a hand has finished with them. The phrases are still there, in the archives. The mineral deposit, the export tariff, the dollar princess. We do not have to carry them with us. We have only to know that they were said, that they were printed, that the daughters read them, and that even so the daughters went on living their lives within the houses on the avenue, doing their lessons and answering their letters and looking out, in the early morning, at the trees in the park as they turned year by year into autumn. Let us linger, for a moment, on the writers themselves, the men who sat at desks in narrow rooms above narrow streets in lower Manhattan, with their typewriters or their dip pens or, in some cases, their dictation to a young clerk who took it all down in shorthand. They were not mostly cruel men. They were working journalists putting out a column a week or a column a day on whatever subject their editor had assigned them. The phenomenon of the dollar princesses was a good subject. It produced reliable copy. It interested readers. It allowed the writer to display his cleverness, which was, in those years, the principal currency of his trade. The writer who proposed the export tariff when he sat down to write that particular column was not, presumably, planning to harm anyone. He was making a joke. He was extending an analogy. He was, in the tradition of his profession, taking a cultural phenomenon and dressing it in the language of another, more prosaic phenomenon in order to make his readers smile a little ruefully at the contrast. This is, in fact, one of the oldest tricks in the writing of newspaper columns. Take a tender subject and describe it in the language of commerce. Take a commercial subject and describe it in the language of the heart. The contrast does the work. The reader feels clever for having noticed it. But sometimes the trick has a sharper edge than the writer intended. Sometimes the analogy, once let out into the world, lasts longer than the column. Sometimes, 100 years later, in the quiet of a library, a different reader picks up the page and reads the joke and feels something the writer did not anticipate. The reader feels the cold weight of the metaphor. The reader feels what it would have meant to be the daughter in the house on the avenue, opening that paper at the breakfast table and reading, in print, that she was a mineral deposit. The daughter very probably did not allow herself to feel that fully at the time. She read the column. She set the paper down. She buttered her toast. She asked her mother whether they would be going for a walk in the park that afternoon. She moved on to the next subject. The world for the daughters of the Avenue did not allow many quiet hours in which to absorb the colder phrases of the press. There were too many other things to do. There were dresses to be fitted. There were lessons to be attended. There were calling cards to be answered. The columns went on existing in the papers, but the daughters had their own days to live, and the days were full, and the columns were, in the end, only paper. Still, somewhere in the back of the daughters' minds the phrases stayed. They settled, as such phrases do, into the slow, background hum of the world. The daughter who would, in a few years, be standing at the rail of an ocean liner in a great fur coat, watching the harbour of New York recede behind her, would remember, perhaps without quite knowing she remembered, the cartoonist's drawing of the girl in white, and the older man in the coronet, and the dollar sign drawn small but unmistakable between them. The phrase would not destroy her. She would not allow it to. But it would be there, somewhere underneath everything else. The way the sound of a city is always somewhere underneath the sound of a particular street, even when one has stopped consciously listening for it. We can let her carry it lightly. The phrase is part of the air she breathes. It is not the whole air. There is also the smell of coffee on a particular grey morning. There is also the warmth of a cup of tea held in two hands. There is also the sound of a clock chiming softly in a little upstairs sitting room. There is also a painting on a wall of a country house in summer, with a small figure in white walking on a long lawn. The world is many things at once. The phrases of the newspapers are some of those things. The phrases are not all of them. The story is patient. The night is long. We have time. Let us do one more small thing before we close this act and let you rest for a while. Let us think for a quiet moment about what the daughters did with all of this. Not what they said about it, because they did not mostly say very much about it. Not what they wrote about it, because they did not mostly write very much about it either, but what they did with it, inside themselves, in the long hours of their own thinking. It is a very old human practice to take a thing that is being done to you and to find some way to also be doing it yourself. To take a script that has been written for you by other people and to discover inside the script the small spaces where your own choices can live. The daughters of the Avenue in those years had been handed a script. The script said where they would live and whom they would marry and what countries they would move to and how their dresses would be cut and which languages they would learn and how they would behave at dinner. The script was very detailed. It left, on the face of it, very little room for anything else. But the daughters were not nothing. They were, each of them, a particular person, with a particular set of small preferences and small refusals and small private loyalties, and inside the script they made their own quiet adjustments. They chose a particular friend more carefully than another. They preferred a particular book over another. They spent a particular extra 15 minutes at a particular window in a particular house, watching a particular set of trees in a way that no one had told them to. They wrote in their diaries on certain rare evenings a sentence that they would not have shown to anyone. They learned very slowly what they liked and what they did not like, even when no one had asked them, even when no one had given them permission to like or dislike anything in particular. These adjustments, made over years, added up to a kind of self. The self was not the self the script had imagined. The self was something quieter and stranger, and more specifically theirs. It survived inside the script. It adapted to the script. It accepted the script mostly because the alternatives were, in that world, not very plausible. But it kept somewhere inside itself a small candle of its own. The candle was small. It was sometimes very small indeed, but it was there. When we read about those women now, 100 years later, in the photographs and the letters and the occasional memoir, what we're often glimpsing is the small candle. The official photograph shows the gown and the title and the tiara. But the candid photograph, taken at a different angle, on a different afternoon in a different mood, sometimes shows the candle, a particular look in the eyes, a particular small smile that does not quite belong to the official version of the day, a particular way of holding a child's hand or a dog's collar or a cup of tea that says gently, "I am still here in some small private place that none of you knows about, and the small private place is mine, and it is enough." We can leave them with their candles. We can leave them with their small private places. We do not need to know what was in those places. We only need to know that the places existed, that the daughters were not entirely consumed by the script that had been written for them, and that the small candle in many of them kept burning quietly, through long years and long countries and long marriages, until the very end. The night is patient, the candles are patient, the story has time. There is a particular kind of quiet that gathers in a house when a daughter is preparing to leave. You may know it yourself from your own life in some other form. The house knows before anyone says it. The corridors hold a slightly different air. The mornings move with a slightly different weight. People speak more softly in the rooms where her clothes are being packed. They speak more brightly in the rooms where she might happen to be passing. In the houses on the avenue, when a daughter was preparing to cross the ocean, the work of that crossing began many months before the ship sailed. The trousseau, as it was called, was not a single suitcase. It was an entire wardrobe, often the entire wardrobe of an entire life prepared in advance, packed into trunks and sent on ahead. A young woman of that world going to live in a great house in England or France or Italy would arrive with everything she might conceivably need for the next several years of her life. Day dresses, evening dresses, walking dresses, riding habits, tea gowns, dinner gowns, ball gowns, travelling cloaks, furs for winter, linen suits for summer, hats, gloves, shoes, stockings, petticoats, corsets, bonnets, shawls, a great deal of underwear, all of it stitched by hand, much of it embroidered with the new initials she would soon begin to use. The making of these things was a slow, lovely industry. A dressmaker would arrive at the house, often with 2 or 3 apprentices, and would set up in a sitting room on an upper floor that had been emptied of its usual furniture. Long tables would be brought in, bolts of fabric would be unrolled across them, satins and silks and wools and laces, ordered in advance from London and Lyon and Paris. The young woman would stand for hours at a time on a small wooden block in the middle of the room, while the dressmaker walked slow circles around her, pinning, measuring, marking with little chips of tailor's chalk. The apprentices would sit on stools by the window, stitching seams in long, patient runs. The light would shift across the walls. Tea would be brought up. The young woman would step down, rest, step up again. The afternoons would soften into evenings. The dresses would, gradually, take their finished shape. It was a kind of peace, those long afternoons. The young woman did not have to talk much. The dressmaker spoke only when she needed to. The apprentices spoke only to each other, in their own quiet little language about thread and needle and the particular nature of a French seam. The young woman could let her mind drift wherever it wished. She could think about the book she was reading. She could think about the letters she had not yet answered. She could think about, occasionally, the man whose name had begun in the past few months to be mentioned in the same sentences as her own. Sometimes the man was someone she'd met. Sometimes he was someone she had only seen in a photograph. Sometimes he was someone whose name she knew from the newspapers, the way one knows the name of a city one has not yet visited. In every case, he would, before long, become her husband. And these dresses, these slow-growing flowers of silk and lace on the long tables of an upper sitting room, were the dresses she would wear in his company. The trousseau was not only clothes, there was linen, sheets and pillowcases and tablecloths and napkins in great stacks, all marked with the new initials. There was china sometimes. There was silver often. There was a writing desk packed in a crate, with paper and pens and sealing wax so that she could write home from the moment she arrived. There were photographs, framed in silver, of her parents and her sisters and her oldest friends, packed carefully in cotton wool to survive the journey. There were favourite books chosen with great care because books on the other side of the ocean would be different and might not for some time be easy to find. There was, in addition to all of this, a settlement. The settlement was the central piece of the whole arrangement, although it was rarely spoken of in the upper sitting room with the dressmaker. The settlement was the document, drawn up by lawyers in 2 countries, that described what the marriage would mean in financial terms, how much the bride's family would settle on her at the time of the wedding, how that money would be invested, who would have the use of the income, who would inherit what and when and under what conditions, what would happen if there were children, and what would happen if there were not, what would happen if the marriage ended, although that last question was usually answered in a way that made it unlikely to be asked again. These documents were long. They were precise. They were the work of months. They were negotiated by men, mostly, in offices far from the upper sitting room with its bolts of silk. The bride's father would have his lawyer. The groom's family would have its solicitor. There would be telegrams across the ocean. There would be amendments and revisions and occasional small disputes. The young woman herself would often as not see only the final version, signed and sealed, and she would not always read it carefully because reading it carefully would have been, somehow, indelicate. The thing was settled. That was what mattered. The thing was settled. The number, when one looks at it now, was very often staggering. A single bride settlement in those decades might be the equivalent of many millions of dollars in our own time. The daughter, in marrying, was not only crossing an ocean, she was carrying, in some abstract financial sense, an entire portion of her father's fortune across that ocean and depositing it on the other side. If you added all of those settlements together, across all those years, across all those 450 marriages, the total comes to something on the order of, in the language of our own time, several $billion. Several $1 billion worth of American family fortunes transferred across the Atlantic, one young woman at a time, over the course of about 40 years. It was, in its way, one of the largest and quietest financial movements of its age. But we are not, tonight, going to dwell on the columns of figures. The figures are there, in the long ledgers of the law firms, and they will keep. We're going to stay, instead, in the upper sitting room, with the apprentices stitching at the window and the dressmaker walking her slow circles around the small wooden block. We're going to stay with the slow building of a wardrobe, with the careful folding of linen into trunks, with the marking of new initials on every corner of every cloth. There is a particular hush to that work that is worth lingering in. The apprentices speak only when they need to. The dressmaker speaks even less. The young woman stands, half listening, half dreaming. The light moves slowly across the walls, falling at first in long bright rectangles, then narrowing, then warming into evening gold, then withdrawing, room by room, until the only light is the small steady glow of a lamp on a side table, casting its yellow circle on the half-finished hem of a dress that will, in a few months, be worn at a ball in a country across the sea. Let us walk for a while around the trunks themselves. They are remarkable objects, those trunks. They were made for this kind of journey, and only for this kind of journey, by craftsmen whose entire trade was the making of luggage for people crossing oceans. They were built of wood and bound with brass. They were lined inside with patterned paper or with cedar planks or with silk. They had small drawers within them, and small compartments, and special trays that lifted out, and special hooks for hanging dresses without crushing them. They had labels on the outside with the family's name and the destination of the journey, lettered in neat black paint by a man who had lettered hundreds of similar trunks for hundreds of similar families. The trunks would be filled slowly over the course of weeks. A maid would come up to the storage room each morning and add new items as they were finished and pressed and folded. The trunks would gradually grow heavier, although the maid would not know exactly how heavy, because she did not lift them. The lifting would be done at the very end by a team of porters who would come to the house with a wagon and carry the trunks, one by one, down the front stairs, out the front door, across the sidewalk and onto the wagon. The porters would tip their caps to the family in a particular ceremonial way that had been agreed upon between their company and the families of the avenue, and then the wagon would roll away down the street toward the docks. 20 trunks was not unusual, 30 was common. In a few extraordinary cases the number reached 50 or 60. Each trunk weighed more than a person. Each trunk required 2 porters to lift. Each trunk had to be checked off, at the docks, against a master list held by a steward of the steamship company, and then carried up a long gangplank and stowed in a particular hold below the level of the main deck, where it would remain for the entire voyage. The young woman herself, of course, did not see most of this. She did not see the porters with the wagon. She did not see the trunks being checked off at the docks. She did not see the long gangplank or the dim hold below decks. She saw only the upper sitting room slowly emptying day by day as the dresses left it. She saw only her own bedroom being gradually stripped of the silver-backed brushes and the cut-glass bottles of cologne and the particular small porcelain dish for hairpins, all of them packed for the voyage, replaced for the moment by simpler objects that would be left behind. The bedroom in those last weeks became a strange in-between place. Half of her was already on the ocean, in the trunks, on the way to a country she'd not yet seen. Half of her was still here, in the bedroom on the avenue, sleeping in her childhood bed, looking at the walls of her childhood paper, listening to the familiar sounds of the familiar house. The two halves of her did not meet in the same room. They were separated in those weeks by the long distance the ship would have to cross. She found, sometimes, that she did not know which half of her she was. She would sit at her vanity table and look at herself in the mirror and find herself thinking, with a small surprise, that she was the daughter of this house, in this city, in this country, and that this was the room she'd grown up in, and this was the avenue she'd grown up on, and that none of these things had stopped being true yet, even though they would, in a particular way, stop being true very soon. Eventually the trunks were closed. Eventually the dressmaker was paid and thanked and sent home, and her apprentices with her. Eventually the upper sitting room was emptied of its long tables and its bolts of fabric, and turned, with quiet efficiency, back into a room where one might simply sit and look out at the trees. Eventually the day of the sailing arrived. The sailing was its own ritual. Whole families would come down to the docks. Carriages would line the wharf. The ship itself, an ocean liner of the period, all white and gold and brass, would be tied up at the long pier, with its tall stacks releasing slow plumes of black smoke into the harbour air. There would be porters with trunks on their shoulders. There would be officers in white uniforms checking lists. There would be the small, intense bustle of many hundreds of passengers boarding at the same time, all of them trying to find their staterooms, their dining tables, their deck chairs. The young woman would walk up the gangplank with her mother on one side and her father on the other. She would wave briefly to a small group of cousins on the dock. She would step onto the deck. She would look back once at the city that had been her whole world. She would see the buildings of Lower Manhattan, the church spires, the smoke of the docks. She would see, beyond all of that, the soft blur of the avenue where her tall house was standing, with its tall windows, with its empty bedroom, with its trees in the park beginning their long, slow turn into autumn. Then she would turn, and she would walk into the body of the ship. Inside, the ocean liner was a small, floating version of the world she was leaving. The dining room was panelled in dark wood, with tall mirrors and chandeliers and small bouquets of fresh flowers on every table. The drawing room had deep armchairs and a piano. The library had shelves of books bound in matching leather. The promenade deck had long rows of chairs covered in soft wool blankets, where one could sit and look out at the sea. There were stewards in white jackets. There were bells that announced the time of dinner. There was in the evenings a small orchestra playing waltzes in the ballroom. For 7 or 8 days she would live inside this slow, floating world. The ocean would unroll itself around her in great grey sheets, with a horizon that never quite came any closer. The sun would rise and set on water. The stars at night would be brighter than she had ever seen them, because there were no city lights for many hundreds of miles. She would walk on the deck wrapped in a long fur coat, with the wind pulling at her hat, and she would feel, perhaps for the first time, the size of the world she was crossing. She would also, in those days, have time to think. The lessons were over. The dressmaker was gone. The trunks were stowed below. There was nothing left to prepare. She had been prepared, finally and entirely, by everyone around her, for a great many years. Now she was simply being delivered. It is a curious word when one applies it to a person. Delivered. A package is delivered. A letter is delivered. A young woman, in a great fur coat on the deck of an ocean liner, looking out at the grey unrolling ocean, can also be delivered, if one is being honest about the language. She is in motion, but she is not moving herself. She is being carried by ship and current and contract from one room of the world to another room of the world, and she will arrive on a particular morning at a particular harbour, and someone will be there to meet her. In her stateroom at night, with the small green-shaded lamp lit beside her bed, she would sometimes write letters, to her sisters mostly, to 1 or 2 friends. The letters were full of small details, the food at dinner, the music of the ship's orchestra, the unexpected shape of a particular wave at sunset. The letters did not mostly speak of the man waiting on the other side. They spoke of the journey, because the journey was what she could see. The destination was still abstract. The stateroom itself was a small kindness. It was not large. It was, by the standards of her bedroom at home, rather modest. But it had been arranged with care. The bed was made up with crisp white sheets and a soft wool blanket, and a coverlet stitched with the emblem of the steamship line. The walls were panelled in pale wood. There was a small writing desk that folded down from the wall, and a small washstand with a porcelain basin and a porcelain pitcher, and a small wardrobe in which her travelling dresses hung in neat order. There was a porthole, round and brass-rimmed, through which she could see the grey ocean rolling by. The porthole could be opened on calm days to let in a stream of cold salt air. She would sit at the small writing desk in the evenings, with the small green-shaded lamp casting its small circle of yellow light on the paper, and she would write. The writing was easy on the ship. The ship rocked gently. The pen moved smoothly. The words came in their own slow rhythm. She would write a paragraph. She would set the pen down. She would look out the porthole at the dark water. She would pick the pen up again and write another paragraph. There was no one to interrupt her. There was nothing she was supposed to be doing instead. The whole long evening was hers, and she could spend it in any way she liked, as long as she eventually came down to dinner at the proper hour. Coming down to dinner was its own gentle event. She would dress carefully. She would walk along the carpeted corridor to the grand staircase. She would descend the staircase with the careful posture she'd been taught. Although on the ship the descent felt different, because the ship was rocking very slightly, and one had to time one's steps to the rocking, and this small attention turned the descent into a kind of dance. At the bottom of the staircase, the head steward would greet her by name and conduct her to her assigned table, where the same small group of fellow passengers would be waiting for her, the same 8 or 10 people she would dine with every evening for the duration of the voyage. Those people, by the 3rd or 4th night, would feel almost like a temporary family. There was always a kindly older couple, returning from a visit to their married daughter in some American city. There was always an English clergyman of some kind, on his way home after a sabbatical lecturing tour. There was always a quiet businessman with no obvious destination. There was always, sometimes, another young American woman, travelling with her own mother, on her own version of the same kind of journey, although the two young women would not mostly discuss the specific shape of their journeys, because to do so would have been a little too direct. They would instead discuss the food. They would discuss the music in the dining room. They would discuss a book one of them was reading. They would discuss, occasionally and very gently, a particular city they were each planning to visit, and what one might do in that city in a particular kind of weather. The conversation would stay on the surface, and that was fine, because the surface was where the voyage lived. The deeper currents, on a ship, could be left to the ship itself. After dinner, the passengers would move into one of the lounges. There would be coffee. There would, on the right kind of evening, be a small recital of music in the ballroom. The orchestra would play waltzes that had been popular 20 years earlier, and a few of the younger passengers would dance slowly and not very well on the polished wooden floor. The young woman might dance occasionally with the younger of the 2 officers assigned to her dinner table. He would be very polite. He would smell faintly of the salt of the deck. The dancing would last for the length of 1 or 2 waltzes, and then she would thank him and return to her seat by her mother, and her mother would smile gently and say nothing, and the evening would continue at its own slow pace. By 11, most of the passengers had drifted away to bed. The young woman would walk back along the corridor to her stateroom. She would undress slowly in the small yellow circle of the lamp and put on her nightgown and brush out her hair. She would lie down in the narrow bed with the crisp white sheets. She would feel the gentle rocking of the ship, which was, she had discovered, the most reliable lullaby she had ever known. The rocking did not stop. It continued, all night, in its slow, patient rhythm like the breathing of some great, quiet creature she had been allowed to lie down beside. She would close her eyes. She would listen to the faint hum of the ship's engines far below her, vibrating gently through the woodwork of the stateroom. She would think sometimes of the bedroom on the avenue, with its silk wallpaper and its silver brushes. She would think sometimes of the great house waiting at the end of the journey, although she could not picture that house clearly, because she had never seen it. She would think sometimes of nothing at all, because the rocking of the ship was so steady and so kind and so unconcerned with anything she might be carrying inside her, that her mind could simply stop carrying it for a while. We will let her sleep there, in her stateroom, with the green-shaded lamp lit, with the soft sound of the ship's engines vibrating gently through the woodwork, with the ocean dark and patient outside her porthole. We will let her sleep because we are after sleep too, and the rocking of an ocean liner is a known balm for the human nervous system, and the pages of her unfinished letter are quiet under her hand, and the long voyage is, in its way, the calmest stretch of her whole life. She's between worlds. She's no longer the girl in the upper bedroom on the avenue. She's not yet the Duchess, or the Countess, or whatever she will become at the end of the journey. She's simply, for these few days, a young woman on a ship, and the ship is moving slowly, and the night is long, and the sea is wide, and the lamp is warm, and there is, for these particular hours, nothing she's required to do. We can let her rest. We will pick the story up again on the other side. A ship comes into a foreign port at the slow end of a long crossing, and the world suddenly has new colours, different gulls, different uniforms on the dock workers, different signs above the warehouses in different lettering, a different quality of light over the water, owing to the latitude and the time of year and the particular shape of the harbour's mouth. The young woman steps off the gangplank into a world that smells unfamiliar even from 100 yards away. There is the salt of the sea, which she's been smelling for a week. But there is something else under it now, a different smell of coal, a different smell of horses, a different smell of the small fried foods being sold by a man at the edge of the dockyard, a different smell of the river that runs into the harbour a little way upstream, a river she will, in time, learn the name of but does not yet know. She is met. There is always someone to meet. Often it is a representative of the family she's marrying into, an older relative or a trusted servant, sent to escort her on the next leg of the journey. Sometimes the husband himself is there, although in many cases he is not because the wedding has not yet taken place, and there are conventions about how much time the two of them should spend in each other's company before that. Sometimes there is also a maid sent from the great house to attend her until her own maid, who has come with her on the ship, can find her bearings in the new country. There is a carriage. The carriage is very often the first thing about the new country that surprises her. It is older than the carriages at home. The wood has been polished by many decades of hands. The leather of the seats is worn into a particular shape that fits other people's bodies. Not hers, not yet. The horses are different. The driver is different. The driver wears a livery she has only seen in books and engravings, and on the 1 or 2 occasions when an old family servant had been described to her, before the servant died, by an elderly aunt with a long memory. The carriage carries her out of the port and into the country. She watches the fields go by. They are not American fields. They are smaller, divided by older walls, often walls of stacked stone. The crops are different. The hedges are different. There are sheep where she expected to see cattle. There are stone bridges where she expected wooden ones. There are villages every few miles, with old churches in the middle of them, with names she does not know how to pronounce. The journey from the port to the great house is sometimes an afternoon, and sometimes 2 days, and sometimes more. There may be a stop at an inn, where she eats a meal in a private dining room set aside for her, with food she does not entirely recognise. There may be a stop at a relative's house, a country house of moderate size, where she is received politely, given tea, shown to a guest room, and sent on her way the next morning with a new addition to her growing list of names she's expected to remember. Eventually, in the soft slant of a particular afternoon, the carriage will turn through a great pair of iron gates. The gates may be open in welcome. They may be held open by an old gatekeeper in a small stone lodge. The drive will go on, sometimes for a mile, sometimes for 2, winding between trees that were planted perhaps in the 17th century. There will be glimpses of a lake. There will be sheep grazing on a long slope. There will be deer, maybe, lifting their heads to watch the carriage pass. And then, at the end of the drive, there will be the house. The houses on this side of the ocean were not like the houses on the avenue. They were not built of new stone, freshly cut and freshly placed. They were built of old stone, weathered and lichen-covered, settled into their land in a way that suggested they had grown there. They were, in many cases, very large, but their largeness was not of the same kind as the largeness of an American mansion. An American mansion was built to be admired in a single glance, from across an avenue, like a painting. A British or French country house had grown over centuries in additions and renovations and restorations, with a wing here from one century and a wing there from another, and a chapel that was older than both of them, and a stable block that was older than the chapel. She would not see all of this on the first day. She would see the front of the house, looming up at the end of the drive with its long line of tall windows reflecting the late afternoon light. She would see the front door, opened by a butler in a tailcoat, with a row of staff lined up on either side of the entrance hall to greet her. She would see, beyond the staff, a great hallway with a stone floor, with portraits along the walls, with a wide staircase going up into the upper floors. She would see, somewhere in the middle of all of this, a small group of family members waiting to meet her. The man she had crossed the ocean to marry would, in many cases, be among them. He might be tall, he might be slender, he might be older than she had imagined. He might have a different sort of voice than she had imagined. He might be kind, he might be reserved, he might be occasionally charming, he might be, on the rare and unlucky occasion, none of these things. And she would discover this quietly, over a number of weeks, and she would, for the most part, keep that discovery to herself. The first meeting was, in the strict customs of those houses, brief and formal. There were introductions. There were small phrases of welcome. There was a movement quite quickly into a smaller room, where tea would be served. The young woman would be seated on a sofa. The mother of the family would be seated across from her. The man would be seated, often slightly to the side. There would be a careful conversation about the journey, the weather on the crossing, the quality of the food on the ship, the reliability of the carriage from the port. Nothing on this first afternoon would be said about the larger arrangement. Nothing about the wedding, nothing about the settlement, nothing about the long shape of the future. The first afternoon, by tradition, was for tea. The room itself in those houses was usually a small drawing room, with deep windows that looked out onto the gardens. The furniture was old, the carpet was old. The fire in the grate was often very large, because the houses were difficult to heat, and the fires were one of the small pleasures the household allowed itself without restraint. The tea was poured into thin cups by an older woman, often a relative, who managed this small ritual the way she had managed it for 40 years. There would be a plate of small sandwiches. There would be, in season, a particular kind of cake associated with that particular county. The young woman at first would not eat much. The journey had been long. The room was warm. The faces around her were new. She would hold her cup in both hands, the way she had been taught not to, and she would feel the warmth of it against her palms, and she would, for a moment, think of the cup of tea she had held on a particular grey morning a year earlier, in a window seat in a tall house on the avenue, watching the lamps along the street being put out one by one in the early light. The two cups, the one in her American window seat and the one in this old English drawing room, would in her mind briefly become the same cup. The 2 mornings would briefly become 1 morning. The trees in the park at home and the trees in the park outside this window would briefly be the same trees, and then, just as gently, they would separate again, because she was here now, in this country, in this house, on this sofa, and the woman across from her, whose tea she was drinking, was now, for all the practical purposes of the rest of her life, her family. She would learn the house slowly. There would be no rush. The wedding would not usually happen for some weeks. There would be, in those weeks, a gradual introduction to the routines of the place. She would learn which staircase led where. She would learn which corridor was cold in the mornings and which was warm in the afternoons. She would learn the names of the senior staff, the housekeeper and the butler, and the head gardener and the cook. She would learn, eventually, the names of the others as well, although that would take longer, because the staff in such a house was large, and the turnover was slow, and the history of who had been there for how long was a subject of considerable importance to the people who lived in those small rooms below the stairs. She would learn the family too, the mother who had received her in the drawing room, the father, often a quiet man, who came down only for dinner, and who spoke mostly about his horses and his land, the brothers and sisters of the man she was marrying, the aunts and uncles who lived in nearby houses and came to dinner once or twice a week, the cousins of whom there were always many. She would walk in the gardens. She would learn the names of the flowers as the gardens shifted with the seasons. She would learn the names of the dogs. There were always dogs. The dogs slept in the great hall by the fire. The dogs followed the master of the house out to the stables. The dogs lay at the feet of the women in the drawing room while they did their needlework. The dogs, in their gentle indifference, were often the first members of the family to make her feel at home, because they did not care whether her name was American or English, and they did not care whether her settlement was sufficient to repair the roof of the east wing, and they only cared, in their slow, doggish way, whether her hand was warm and her voice was kind. There is something to be said, in particular, for the dogs. Every great house had its dogs, and the dogs ran, in their own way, a parallel household alongside the human one. They had their own routines. They had their own preferred chairs in the drawing room, although they were officially not allowed on the chairs and were officially shooed off whenever a senior member of the household happened to notice them. They had their own meals, brought to them in metal bowls in the back hallway by a particular undercook who had a soft spot for them. They had their own friendships, with each other and with certain of the staff. The old retriever was on particularly close terms with the head gardener, who slipped him pieces of biscuit every morning at the gardener's break. The two younger spaniels were on good terms with the housekeeper, who would let them sleep in her sitting room on cold afternoons. The young woman, in her early weeks, would often find herself spending more time with the dogs than with the human members of the household. The dogs did not require small talk. The dogs did not have to be addressed in the right form. The dogs could simply be sat down beside on a window seat in some quiet corner of the house and stroked behind the ears, while she looked out at the gardens and gathered her thoughts. The dogs, in their warm, breathing way, were a kind of bridge. They had been there before her. They would be there after her. They did not particularly care which century she had been born in, or which country had paid for her trousseau. They cared simply that her hand was on their head, and that her hand was warm, and that the afternoon was long and quiet and unconcerned with anything in particular. We will leave her there for now, in the great drawing-room, in the soft afternoon light, with the dogs at her feet and the tea in her cup, and the old portraits looking down at her from the walls. We will let her rest in this new place, with all its strangeness arranged around her like an unfamiliar garden. We have plenty of time. The wedding is not yet. The trousseau is not yet unpacked. The whole long shape of her new life is still ahead of her, soft and unwritten, with all the patience of a house that has been standing for 400 years and is in no particular hurry about anything at all. Let us think for a quiet stretch about the gardens, because the gardens of those houses were among the places where the young woman, in her first weeks, was most often able to feel a kind of slow ease. The gardens were old. They had been laid out, in many cases, in the late 17th or early 18th century, by men whose names appeared in the family records but whose faces had been forgotten. They had been altered, over the decades, by successive generations of owners, each of whom had added a little something. A new walk lined with limes, a new pond with water lilies, a new small folly at the end of a long avenue, built to look like a Roman temple in miniature, although no one was quite sure why anyone had wanted a Roman temple in the middle of a Buckinghamshire field. The result, by the end of the 19th century, was a kind of layered landscape, in which every walk and every pond and every folly had a story behind it, although most of the stories had been lost. She would walk in the gardens in the early mornings, often with one of the spaniels at her heels. She would walk slowly, there was no need to walk quickly. The gardens were enormous, but they did not require her to cover them. She could simply walk 100 yards down a particular path and stop and look at a particular tree and turn around and walk back. The gardens did not mind. The gardens were happy to be walked in any shape one liked. She would learn the smells of the gardens, which changed with the seasons. The smell of damp box hedges in the autumn, the smell of cut grass in early summer, the smell of the kitchen garden behind a particular wall, where the herbs grew in long careful rows, and the air on warm afternoons was thick with rosemary and thyme and sage. The smell of the lake, which was a particular green watery smell that she had not encountered in America, where the bodies of water she had known had all been larger and saltier and less still. She would learn also the small sounds of the gardens, the wood pigeons in the high trees calling their slow soft calls in the early morning, the crunch of gravel under her boots, the small splash of a duck on the lake, the distant click of a gardener's shears at work in some far hedge, the deep thrum of bees in the lavender beds, the slow creaking of an old garden gate that had been opening and closing on the same hinges for 200 years. These sounds, in time, would replace the sounds of New York in her ear. The sounds of New York would not disappear. They would stay, somewhere in her memory, as a kind of background. But the sounds of the gardens would gradually become the sounds her ear settled on first. The wood pigeons would, in time, become the sound she associated with home, more than the carriage wheels of the avenue. The crunch of gravel under her boots would, in time, become the sound of her own walking, more than the click of her own heels on a marble entrance hall. This kind of slow exchange, sound for sound and smell for smell, was the real work of becoming a person who lived in this country. It happened so slowly that she did not notice it happening. It happened, in fact, mostly while she was thinking about other things. She would be walking in the garden with the spaniel at her heels, thinking about a letter she was planning to write to her sister, and a wood pigeon would call from the high trees, and she would not notice the wood pigeon because she was thinking about the letter. But the wood pigeon's call would settle all the same into the slow background of her ear, and one day, several years later, she would be walking in some other place, perhaps in a city, perhaps on a beach, and she would hear a wood pigeon, and she would feel with a small unexpected pang that she was hearing the sound of home. The garden was patient. The garden was teaching her in this slow incidental way who she was now. She did not have to study the lessons. She did not have to write them down. She had only to walk in the garden with the spaniel, and to breathe the air of the garden, and to listen to the sounds of the garden, and the lessons would teach themselves. We will let her walk. The path is long, the morning is cool, the spaniel is happy, the wood pigeons are calling. There is, for these particular hours, nothing she is required to do. Weddings, in the world we are walking through, were public events. They were not private ceremonies for a small group of family and close friends. They were, very often, civic occasions, attended by hundreds of people, photographed by newspapers, written about for weeks before and weeks after. The wedding of a young American heiress to a British or French or Italian noble was, by the 1890s, almost a kind of seasonal entertainment, the way a major sporting event might be in another decade. It was looked forward to, it was reported on, it was discussed by people who had no connection to either family and would not have been admitted to either's drawing room. The wedding itself, on its day, would take place in a particular church or cathedral, sometimes the family's own private chapel, but more often, for the larger weddings, a church chosen for its grandeur and its capacity. The bride would arrive in a carriage, often a state carriage borrowed for the occasion, with her father beside her. The streets between the family's London townhouse and the church would be lined with onlookers. People would stand on small wooden boxes to see over the heads of others. Children would sit on their parents' shoulders. Photographers would set up at every corner. Inside the church the air would be still. The flowers would be enormous. White roses, white lilies, sometimes orchids brought in from a private greenhouse. The organ would play softly, from somewhere up in a high gallery, while the guests took their seats. The pews would fill. The dukes and counts and cousins of one country would sit on one side. The bankers and railroad heirs and society mothers of another country would sit on the other side. They would smile at each other politely across the aisle, the way two parties might smile at each other across a small, quiet stream on the morning of an agreement. The bride would walk up the aisle on her father's arm. She would be wearing a gown that had taken 5 months to make. The lace on her veil would be older than her grandmother. The pearls around her neck would have been, in many cases, a gift from the groom's family, a string of pearls that had been worn at 6 weddings before hers and would be worn at 6 more after. A kind of family object passed down through the women of the line, each new bride borrowing it for her own day and then handing it back to be put away, in its velvet case, in a particular drawer, until the next time it was needed. The vows would be exchanged in the language of the country she was now joining. If she was joining an English family, the vows would be the English vows, the old words about loving and honouring and cherishing, the old promises about better and worse and richer and poorer. If she was joining a French or Italian family, the vows might be in those languages, although a Catholic wedding had its own further set of words in Latin that everyone agreed to without quite always understanding them in the moment. She would say her vows, he would say his. The minister or the priest or the bishop, depending on the rank of the wedding, would pronounce them married. The choir in the upper gallery would sing. The bells of the church, in some cases the bells of an entire neighbourhood of churches, would ring out across the city. The newly married couple would walk down the aisle, hand in hand, into a great noise of organ and bells and the polite, careful applause of 1,000 people. Outside the church the crowd would be enormous. The carriage would be waiting. The two of them would step into it, accompanied by a final shower of rose petals or rice, or, in some traditions, of small white sugared almonds. The carriage would carry them through the cheering streets, back to wherever the wedding breakfast was being held, usually a great house in town, where another 200 or 300 people were already gathered, ready to eat and toast and dance and continue the long public ceremony of the day. It was in every sense a spectacle. It was meant to be a spectacle. The whole point, in many cases, was that the wedding be seen and that the seeing of it confirm, in the eyes of two countries, the joining of two kinds of capital. The American newspapers in those years would carry detailed descriptions of the gowns, the flowers, the cake, the menu, the music, the guest list. The English and French papers would carry, often, a slightly different sort of description, more attentive to lineage and less attentive to dollars, but no less careful in its detail. There is a quiet, very small thing that I want to mention here, because it sits at the heart of this part of the story, and we will let it sit there gently and then we will move past it. In every one of those weddings, in every one of those long ceremonies, there was always one moment, somewhere in the day, when the bride was alone for a few minutes. Perhaps she was being helped out of the great heavy gown and into a slightly lighter dress for the wedding breakfast. Perhaps she was waiting in a small side room while the carriage was made ready. Perhaps she was simply standing at a window, with a glass of water in her hand, while her new mother-in-law spoke to the clergy in another room. Whatever the particular shape of those few minutes, every one of those brides had them. A small pause inside the long public day. A pause in which the bride could, if she wished, look out at the world for a moment and feel where she was. She had been a daughter when she went into the church. She was a wife when she came out. Somewhere, between the two, she had crossed a small invisible line, and the line had no marker, and no one in the cheering streets knew exactly where it had been. Often she did not feel anything in particular in those few minutes. Sometimes she felt a small, distant calm, the way one feels after the end of a long examination. Sometimes she felt a flicker of a feeling she did not entirely recognize, something between relief and a kind of soft regret, although she would not have called it that and would not often have spoken of it to anyone. Often, mostly, she simply felt tired. The day had been very long, the dress had been very heavy, the bells had been very loud, the faces had been very many. A few minutes alone with a glass of water, in a small side room in a great house in a strange city, was, in its way, the most generous gift the day could give her. We can leave her there, in those few minutes. We do not have to follow her back out into the wedding breakfast. We do not have to follow her, later that evening, to the train station where the honeymoon journey will begin. We do not have to follow her, weeks later, to the great house where the rest of her life will be slowly and quietly laid out for her, in routines and seasons and visiting cousins and growing children. We can let her stand at her window with her glass of water. We can let the air come in from outside. We can let her hear, from a great distance, the muffled sound of the celebration continuing without her. The orchestra in another room, the laughter of the guests, the low rumble of carriages moving through the wet streets. She is fine. The day is long, but it is also now mostly behind her. She has done what was asked. She has worn the gown and said the words and signed her name where she was asked to sign it. She has, with a single afternoon of standing very still in a tall church, transferred a fortune across an ocean and acquired a title that will be on her gravestone someday. The work of the day is complete. The work of a life will continue tomorrow, but it will continue at its own pace, in its own quiet way, and she does not tonight have to think about any of it. She finishes her glass of water. She sets it down on the small marble-top table beside the window. She rests her hand on the windowsill for a moment and feels the cool stone against her fingers and looks out at the sky, which is going pink and gold above the rooftops of the city, and thinks of nothing in particular. Sleep, of course, is hours away. The evening still has its requirements, but for a moment, alone, with her hand on the cool stone, she has a small private piece of the day that no one will ever ask her about. It is enough. It is, in its very small way, enough. Let us think for a long quiet moment about the wedding gown itself, because the wedding gown is one of the small physical objects that survives, sometimes, into the present day, and that allows us to feel, across the distance of more than 100 years, the actual cloth that was worn on the actual afternoon of the actual wedding. Some of those gowns are still here. They have been preserved in particular careful museums, in particular careful glass cases, in particular careful conditions of light and humidity. They have been mounted on faceless mannequins, the way wedding gowns are always mounted in museums, and they hang there in their long white silence, with their long sleeves and their long trains and their long rows of pearl buttons, looking, in some sense, exactly the way they looked on the day they were worn. If you go to see one of these gowns, on a quiet weekday afternoon when the museum is mostly empty, you can stand in front of the glass case for a long time. You can look at the lace on the bodice, which was made by a particular lacemaker in a particular town in Belgium or France by hand, over the course of months, in a small cottage with poor light. You can look at the buttons down the back, which were sewn on by a particular seamstress, in a particular workroom, in a particular American city, on a particular day in the late summer of a particular year. You can look at the hem, which is, in many of these gowns, slightly worn, slightly grass-stained, slightly torn in one or two places where a heel might have caught it on the way down a flight of stairs. The gown is a record. It carries in its small marks the actual movements of an actual woman through an actual day. The slight wear at the hem says she walked, on grass somewhere, perhaps in the gardens of a great house after the ceremony. The slight discoloration at one cuff says she rested her hand perhaps on a banister, or on the back of a chair, or on the arm of someone who had been holding a glass of red wine. The slight impression on the bodice says someone embraced her, gently, perhaps a sister, perhaps a mother, perhaps a friend who had come from a long way away to see her on this day, and would not, after this day, see her again for many years. The mannequin in the glass case does not have a face. The mannequin is a smooth white form designed to display the gown without distracting from it. But if you stand long enough in front of the glass, you can put a face on the mannequin, in your own mind. You can give her the face of the woman who wore the gown. You can give her perhaps the small, careful smile from the wedding photograph, the smile that said, in one of its layers, that everything was as it was meant to be, and in another of its layers something quieter that the photographer had not been told about. The gown does not tell us what was in those quieter layers. The gown is only cloth. But the gown is here, after 100 years and more, still bearing faintly the marks of the day. It has outlasted the woman. It has outlasted the husband. It has outlasted the great house and the lawyers and the writers of the columns about mineral deposits. It is still in its glass case, still white, still patient, still waiting, in some sense, for someone to come and stand in front of it and notice it and feel, faintly, the long shape of the life it once stood for. We can let it stay there. We can let it rest in its glass case, in the soft museum light, behind its gentle climate-controlled glass. We can let it keep its small marks, its faint stains, its quiet record of a particular afternoon long ago. We can let it be what it is, which is a piece of cloth that was once a dress, and is now a kind of slow letter, addressed to anyone who happens to walk through the museum on a quiet weekday afternoon and stop and look. We will leave her, the woman who wore it, in her small side room with her glass of water, in the pink and gold light of the late afternoon. The door is closed, the window is open, the air is cool, the day is, at last, mostly behind her. The bells have stopped ringing, the crowds have moved on to other parts of the city. The gown, in this moment, is still on her, although a maid will come, in a little while, to help her out of it. The half-hour belongs to her. The half-hour does not belong to anyone else. She rests her hand on the windowsill, she breathes. She closes her eyes for a moment. The light, even through her closed eyelids, is soft and warm and forgiving. The half-hour is patient. The world, for these particular minutes, is patient. There is no train to catch yet. There is no carriage to step into yet. There is no honeymoon hotel waiting for her arrival yet. There is only this small window, and this small hand on this small windowsill, and this small piece of pink and gold sky above the rooftops, and this small, kind, unhurried half-hour that no one will ever fully know about, even after the gown is in its glass case, and the photographs are in their archives, and the husband and the wife and everyone who attended the wedding have all at last gone into their own small private quietness. It is enough. It is, in its very small way, enough. We will leave her there. A great house in the English or French or Irish countryside in the years between 1870 and the First World War had a particular shape to its days, and the shape of its days was the shape of the new wife's life from the moment she arrived. The household woke early, although not all at once. The first to rise were the under-servants, the kitchen maids and the boot boy and the under-housemaids, who came down the back stairs in the dark, lit candles, raked out the previous night's fires, and laid the new ones. By the time the upper servants came down, the kitchen was warm, the kettles were on, and the long copper pans were already starting their first slow simmer of the day's work. By 7:30, fires were lit in the family rooms. By 8, breakfast was being laid in the breakfast room. The breakfast room, in those houses, was different from the dining room. The dining room was a great long-tabled hall used for formal meals. The breakfast room was smaller, often east-facing, with a round table and a sideboard, designed for the more casual meal that began the day. The new wife, in the early weeks of her marriage, would come down to breakfast at a particular hour, usually around 9. She would find the sideboard laid with a long row of silver dishes, each kept warm by a small spirit lamp underneath. There would be eggs, there would be bacon, there would be in many houses kippers, those small smoked herrings that the English ate for breakfast with such persistent affection. There would be kidneys in some form. There would be cold meats. There would be toast in a small silver rack, slightly stiff. There would be a pot of marmalade. There would be tea in a heavy silver pot and coffee in another. The newspapers would be folded on a side table, because reading the newspaper at breakfast in those houses was a small permitted indulgence even in households that frowned on conversation before noon. She would help herself quietly to whatever she liked. She would sit at the table. Sometimes her husband would join her. Sometimes he would already have eaten and gone out. Sometimes the other members of the family staying in the house would come and go in their own rhythms, nodding at her, taking their plates, settling into their chairs, opening their newspapers, and disappearing into the silent shared activity of an English country breakfast. After breakfast, the day spread out in front of her. She might walk in the gardens, she might write letters in the morning room, she might receive callers, although in the country callers were less frequent than in town. She might ride if she rode, although learning to ride well in the English style was one of the small adjustments many American brides had to make in their first year, because the saddles were different, and the country was different, and the horses, gentle as they were, knew their own ways and expected the rider to understand them. The middle of the day was usually given to luncheon, a meal that was, in those houses, less formal than dinner, but still served by staff at a properly laid table. Soup, a fish dish, a meat dish, a pudding, a small glass of wine for those who wished it. The conversation at luncheon was relaxed. People discussed the weather, they discussed the village, they discussed the tenants, they discussed the dogs. The afternoon was the long, quiet stretch of the day. In summer there might be tennis on the lawn, or a picnic by the lake, or a slow expedition with a sketchbook to draw a particular view from a particular hill. In winter there might be tea by the fire in the library with novels and letters and a card game in the corner. The afternoon for the new wife was the part of the day in which she most often felt the strangeness of the country settle on her shoulders, because the afternoon was when she had time to notice the small differences, the angle of the light, the smell of the wood being burned in the fire, which was different from the smell of the coal she had grown up with, the particular sound of rooks in the trees outside, which she had never heard in New York, and which would, in time, become one of the sounds she most associated with the rest of her life. Tea, at 4:30, was its own small ceremony. The tea things were brought into the drawing room on a wheeled trolley. The tea was poured. There were small sandwiches with the crust cut off. There were scones, with butter and cream and jam. There was, in many houses, a particular cake associated with that household, made by that household's cook, the recipe written down in a battered notebook in the kitchen, and unchanged for 40 years. Tea in those houses was the meal at which the new wife often did her best work of integration. The drawing room was warm, the conversation was light. Members of the family came and went. A neighbour from a nearby house might call, a cousin might appear, a vicar might be invited to discuss some small matter to do with the parish church. The new wife learned slowly to participate in this conversation, to know which neighbours were currently in good standing and which had given offence, to know which families were related to which other families, to know which engagements had recently been announced in the county and which were merely rumoured. Dinner, in those houses, was the central performance of the day. Dinner was when the family dressed properly. Dinner was when the great dining room was used. Dinner was when the silver came out, and the candles were lit, and the long table was laid with all the pieces of china and crystal that had accumulated over generations. The dinner itself was elaborate. It moved through many courses: soup, fish, a first meat, a second meat sometimes, a salad, a pudding, a savoury, cheese, fruit, coffee, a glass of port for the gentlemen, after the ladies had withdrawn to the drawing room. The whole meal might last 2 hours. The conversation, at dinner, was carried on quietly between neighbours at the table, the way 1,000 small conversations are carried on at 1,000 other dinner tables on 1,000 other evenings, with the small currents and countercurrents of a community that knew itself well. After dinner, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, where coffee was served, and the gentlemen remained at the table for a while, drinking their port and discussing their own particular subjects. After perhaps half an hour, the gentlemen joined the ladies in the drawing room, and the rest of the evening might be given to music or to cards or to a long, slow conversation that wound down toward bedtime around 10:30. Bedtime in those houses was its own quiet ritual. Candles were lit at the foot of the staircase. Each member of the family took a candle and walked up the great staircase to their own room. The new wife, in her own room, would find her maid waiting to help her undress. The clothes would come off in their long, careful order. The bath, in many cases, would be drawn earlier in the evening before dinner, and now there was simply the brushing of the hair, and the changing into a nightdress, and the slipping into a great wide bed in a great cool room. The bedrooms in those houses were enormous, often the size of a small ballroom. They had high ceilings. They had wide windows, often with shutters that closed against the cold. They had heavy curtains. They had a fire lit by a maid in the early evening, that was banked down to coals by the time the family came up. They had a single small lamp on a bedside table, with a soft shade. They had silence, mostly, except for the faint sound of the wind in the trees outside, or the distant rook settling for the night, or very occasionally the call of an owl from somewhere across the park. She would lie in that bed, in those first weeks, and she would feel the bigness of the country around her. The country was much older than the country she had come from. The land had been farmed for 2,000 years. The roads had been laid down, in many places, by Roman soldiers. The church in the village she could see from her window had been built in the 11th century, and the pew she had sat in on the previous Sunday had been used by the family she had married into for 16 generations. There were 16 generations of someone else's family in the floors of the house she was now sleeping in. There were 16 generations of someone else's tablecloths in the linen press at the end of her corridor. She herself was new. She was the newest thing in the whole house. The plaster on the wall was older than she was. The carpet on the floor was older than she was. The books in the library were older than she was. The dogs by the fire were older than she was, although they would, in their gentle, doggish way, outlive her ownership of the bedroom in question by only a few years. She would lie in that bed and listen to the wind in the trees, and she would think sometimes of her bedroom on the avenue. She would think of the pale silk wallpaper with its small painted garlands. She would think of the silver-backed brushes on the vanity table. She would think of the trees in the park, in their small American park, with their small American leaves turning their small American gold each October. And then, slowly, she would think instead of the new things, the way the light came in the new windows, the smell of the new fire, the sound of the new rooks, the particular small creak of the new bed, the particular pattern in the new curtains. The new house, in its way, would begin to fold around her, the way a coat folds around a body that has been cold for a long time, and she would, in time, fall asleep. Let us walk for a stretch through the rooms of that house in the small private hours when no one is in them. The rooms of a great house late at night are some of the most peaceful rooms in the world. The fires have died down to coals. The candles have been put out. The staff have retired to their own rooms in the upper floors of the wing they share. The family have gone up the great staircase to their bedrooms. The dogs have settled finally in their preferred sleeping spots in the great hall. The old retriever stretched out in front of the dying fire. The two younger spaniels curled together on a rug at the foot of the stairs. The rooms in this hour are simply themselves. They are not performing for anyone. The drawing room sits in its own quiet, with its silk-upholstered chairs slightly disarranged from where people had been sitting in them in the evening. The library sits in its own quiet, with its books along the walls and a single open novel face down on a small table beside one of the deep armchairs. The dining room sits in its own quiet, with its long table cleared and its chairs pushed in and its candles guttered down to small wax stumps in their silver holders. The morning room sits in its own quiet, with the small writing desk by the window and the half-finished letter blotted and folded and left for the morning. The rooms are old. They have done this before. They have sat in their own quiet in the small hours on many thousands of nights. They are good at it. They know the shape of a quiet room better than any of the people who pass through them. The walls have a settled steadiness. The floors have a gentle creak that has been the same gentle creak for 2 centuries. The furniture has the worn comfort of having been sat on by many people. none of whom are sitting on it now. A clock chimes somewhere, very softly, 3 or 4. The exact hour does not matter. The chime is muffled by walls and curtains and the long stretch of corridor between the clock and any human ear. The chime simply marks itself, into the quiet, and is gone. Outside, the gardens lie in their own dark stillness. The walks are empty. The hedges are dark shapes against a slightly less dark sky. The lake, somewhere down the slope of lawn, is a black mirror with the moon, sometimes, drawn faintly across its surface. The deer are bedded down somewhere in the far park, invisible. The owl, who hunts on these particular acres on these particular nights, is at work in one of the woodlands beyond the lake, although no one in the house can hear him from this distance. The young wife, in her bed in her great cool room, is asleep. She does not know how long she has been asleep. She does not need to know. The room holds her gently. The fire glows faintly in the grate. Just a dim red shape now, almost gone, but still warm. The curtains are drawn. The windows are closed against the cold of the early hours. Her breath, in her sleep, is slow and even. Her face, in the dim red light, looks very young, much younger than she looks in the daytime, when the requirements of being a wife of this house have settled their weight onto her shoulders. In sleep the weight is set down. In sleep she is, for these particular hours, only herself. The house holds her. The house has held many sleepers before her. The house will hold many sleepers after her. The house is, in some sense, made of sleep, made of the long, quiet hours when nobody is doing anything in particular, when the fires are dying and the clocks are chiming softly, and the dogs are dreaming on their rugs and the walls are settling very faintly into themselves. We can walk on through the rest of the rooms gently without disturbing anything. We can pass through the great hall where the old retriever twitches one paw in his sleep, dreaming perhaps of a rabbit. We can pass up the great staircase with the family portraits looking down from the walls in the dim moonlight that comes in through the high window above the landing. We can pass along the upper corridor, where each closed door holds its own sleeper in its own quiet. We can pass the door of her room, where she lies in her great cool bed with her long hair loose on the pillow, and we can pause for a moment, gently, and listen to her breathing, and know that she is well. Then we can pass on. There are other corridors, there are other rooms. There is the corridor that leads to the chapel, with its small stone arch above the door. There is the corridor that leads to the library, with its long row of low bookcases lining the walls. There is the corridor that leads down to the kitchens, although we will not go down there now because the kitchens have their own life, and their own people, and their own slow cycle of waking and sleeping, and we do not need to enter that life tonight. We can simply walk through the dim hush of the upper corridors, past the closed doors of the sleeping family, past the small arched windows looking out onto the dark gardens, past the small landings with their small chairs that nobody has sat in since the evening of 3 Tuesdays ago. We can walk until we have walked enough, and then we can stop, and we can stand still for a moment in the dim hush, and we can let the house go on doing what the house does, which is to hold its sleepers gently in their rooms without asking anything of them until the morning. The house is patient, the house has time, we have time as well. She would not, in those early years, write home very often about the difficulty of any of this. The letters she sent home, as they survive in family papers in archives now, are mostly cheerful. They describe the gardens, they describe the dinners, they describe the funny things the dogs have done, they describe the visits to the village, they describe the small new traditions of her new household the way she might, 10 years before, have described the small new traditions of a school she had been sent away to. She is, in those letters, a girl describing a place that has mostly accepted her, and that she has mostly accepted in return. Whether the letters are entirely truthful is a question the letters themselves do not answer. They are the letters that a daughter writes home to a mother. They are the letters that a sister writes home to a sister. They are the letters of a young woman doing her best to make her family feel, on the other side of an ocean, that she is well, and that she is not lonely, and that the great machine of the marriage is functioning as everyone hoped it would. We can let the letters be what they are. We can let her, in the bedroom that is now hers, fall asleep beneath the heavy old curtains, with the new fire glowing low in the grate, with the new rooks calling their last calls outside the window, with the new house folding itself slowly around her in the dark. Sleep is patient here too. The house has been here a long time. There is no rush. Everything that is going to happen has, in some sense, already happened, 16 generations of times before, in this very room. The wife in the bed is one of many. The fire in the grate has burned for many. The wind in the trees has sounded the same on many other nights, for many other women in this same wide bed, with the same low coals and the same high ceiling and the same far quiet. Some of the letters survive. That is one of the small mercies of how the world keeps its papers. Most of them have been lost or burned or thrown out by descendants who thought they were tidying up. But some of them are still there, in archives and family collections, tied with faded ribbons in cardboard boxes, written in the careful handwriting of young women 100 years ago. If you go looking for them, in the quiet upper rooms of certain libraries, with white gloves on your hands and a soft pencil at your elbow, you can read them. The pages are, in many cases, soft and a little yellowed. The ink has gone faintly brown. The paper has the slightly grainy feel of high-quality stationery from before the First World War, marked in many cases with a small embossed crest at the top, the new crest, the one she's only recently acquired. The letters are mostly short. They are mostly from a daughter to a mother. They begin, almost always, with a small remark about the weather, or about the journey, or about whether a previous letter had been received. They progress through the small news of the household, who has visited, what was eaten, whether the gardener has succeeded in growing a particular flower, whether the husband is well, in a particular impersonal phrase, whether the husband's mother is well, in another particular phrase, whether there is news of a sister in another country house, whether the children, when there are children, have recovered from a small fever, or are doing well at their lessons, or have gone to stay with cousins in another county. The letters do not mostly speak of the larger story. They do not speak of the settlement that brought the daughter across the ocean. They do not speak in plain words of homesickness. They do not speak of the slow strangeness of the country, or of the cold of the corridors, or of the small repeated misunderstandings with a husband who, although kind enough, was raised by a mother who had not always approved of the marriage, and who had, in the early years, kept her own counsel about it. The letters speak instead around all of that. They describe the surfaces, they describe the safe topics, they mention the dogs more often than the husband, they mention the gardens more often than the dogs, they mention the weather more often than anything else, because the weather is the safest of all subjects, and an English winter or a Scottish autumn or an Irish spring will happily fill 4 or 5 paragraphs of a letter without anyone having to say anything difficult. It would be easy, reading those letters now, to feel that the daughters were unhappy and were hiding it. It would also be easy to feel that the daughters were not very unhappy at all, that the world they had entered was, in many of its surfaces, pleasant, and that they were doing their best to live a real life inside a real house with real concerns and real small joys, and that their letters simply reflected that. The truth, almost certainly, is that both things were true at once. There was unhappiness somewhere underneath, of a kind that did not always have a clean name. There was also genuine pleasure in many of the days. There was a real love in some of the marriages that grew up slowly over time, the way ivy grows up the side of a wall, not because anyone planted it on purpose, but because the wall was there, and the ivy was there, and the years were long, and the conditions were right. There was, in other marriages, a real polite distance that lasted a lifetime, with neither great love nor great rupture, just the long, slow shape of 2 people sharing a house, and raising children, and managing tenants, and attending the same dinner parties season after season after season. Some of the daughters, over time, became famous in their adopted countries. They became hostesses of considerable importance. They opened their houses to politicians and writers and artists. They became known, in the gossip columns of London or Paris, as the American Duchess, or the American Countess, or the American Princess, with the particular phrasing depending on the local language. Their accents by middle age had often softened into something that was no longer quite American and not quite local, a kind of in-between accent that marked them, gently, as belonging to neither country and to both. Some of them, in the longer view, played quiet but real roles in the public life of their adopted countries. They sat on hospital boards, they patronized schools, they funded scholarships. They became, in their own ways, useful members of the small ruling class they had married into. They were, in many cases, very good at the work. They had been raised in a culture that prized competence in the running of large households, and they applied that competence, when they had the chance, to the running of the larger institutions, The institutions were, in many cases, the better for it. Some of them became deeply involved with their own children, devoting the long afternoons of their lives to the slow, patient work of raising them, teaching them languages, walking with them in the gardens, choosing their tutors, watching them grow up into young people who carried, in their faces and voices, a strange double inheritance. The children of those marriages were, in their own way, the most interesting of all. They were neither American nor European exactly. They were a new sort of person, born in a house in Buckinghamshire or Tuscany or Gascony, with grandmothers in Manhattan and grandfathers in Worcestershire, with names that included both old American family names and old European family names, with a way of speaking that drew gently from both sides of the ocean. Some of those children grew up to be writers, and they wrote about their parents and their parents' marriages and the world they had grown up inside of. Their books are some of the best windows we have onto that world. They tend to be tender about their mothers in particular. They tend to describe a woman who was, in some way, both fully present and slightly elsewhere, who loved them deeply, and who, even as she loved them, sometimes seemed to be looking out a window at a different country, or listening very faintly for the sound of a particular set of trees in a particular park 3,000 miles away. We can think for a moment of one of those children, a son perhaps, born in a great house in the south of England in 1893, who has been put to bed by his mother on a soft September evening. The mother sits at the side of the small bed for a few minutes, in the lamplight, and she sings him a song. The song is not an English song. The song is a small American song that her own mother used to sing to her, a long time ago, in a tall house on an avenue across the sea. The boy will not remember the song when he is older. He will remember only the sound of his mother's voice singing it, in a particular small key, in the warm dark of the bedroom, with the lamp beside the bed and the curtains drawn against the autumn wind outside. That song, travelling quietly from one country to another, from one generation to another, in the soft voice of a tired young woman in the lamplight, is one of the things that the great public arrangement, with its settlements and its tariffs and its newspaper cartoons, did not fully account for. It carried, the great public arrangement, a number of unintended cargoes: American songs into English nurseries, American recipes into English kitchens, American holidays, kept quietly by an American mother in an English house, with English servants, who learned after a few years to bring out the right china for a Thanksgiving dinner, because the lady of the house liked to keep that particular tradition alive, even if no one else in the county had any idea what to do with it. The arrangement was not only a transaction, it also became, in time, a kind of slow weaving. American and European threads, going under and over each other in countless small acts of daily life, in countless conversations and recipes and lullabies, and small choices about how to raise a child. The weaving was uneven. Some of the daughters no doubt never felt at home. Others felt at home, at last, after 20 years, in a way they had not expected. Others felt at home from the start, surprising themselves and everyone around them. We do not have to choose, tonight, between the unhappy version of the story and the contented version. Both are real. The unhappy version is the version the newspapers like to tell, because unhappiness is a story with a clear shape. The contented version is the version that lived in the daily life of the houses, in the quiet of the breakfast rooms and the slow rhythm of the gardens, and the patient love that grew up, in some marriages, over decades. Both versions were true. Both versions, in the long run, are part of the same long letter that those years wrote to the years that followed. Let us picture, for a long quiet moment, an old woman sitting in a chair by a window in a great house in the English countryside in 1945. She's in her late 60s or early 70s. She has lived in this house for 50 years. She came across the ocean in a great fur coat as a young woman in the 1890s. She has buried her husband, whom she came, in time, to love in her own particular way. She has raised 3 children, 2 of whom are still alive. She has watched 2 world wars come and go. She has watched the staff of the great house dwindle year by year from 40 to 20 to 12 to 6. She has seen the gardens shrink and the east wing closed up, and the silver, much of it, sold quietly to pay the new tax bills. She sits by the window with a cup of tea. The cup is one of the original cups from the original wedding service. There are not many of them left. The set has been broken down, over the decades, by parlour maids and by children and by an unfortunate dog. She holds the cup in both hands the way she's been doing since she was 17. She looks out the window at the trees in the park. The trees are very old now. She remembers when they were a little younger. Somewhere, in the long quiet middle of the afternoon, she thinks of her own mother, dead now for 30 years, and of the avenue, and of the tall house, and of the silver-backed brushes on the vanity table. She thinks of the morning when she first sat at the window with her own cup of tea and watched the lamplighter making his rounds in the early grey light. She's quiet, the way only a woman who has lived a long time can be quiet. She does not regret her life. She does not exactly wish it had been otherwise. She only holds very gently the long shape of it in her mind, like a letter she wrote to herself many years ago, and is only just now finding the time to read. Outside, a single rook calls from the top of one of the old trees. The sound is the same sound it has been making for 40 years. The fire in the grate has burned down to coals. The light in the room is going soft and yellow at the edges. The old woman closes her eyes for a moment. The cup of tea is still warm in her hands. The world in this small room, in this great house, on this long afternoon, in this country that has, over 50 patient years, become her own, is at peace. We can let her rest there. We can let the rook call. We can let the fire ember down. We can let the room go softly into evening, the way rooms have been doing in that house, since long before she arrived, and the way they will continue to do in some other form long after she's gone. There are other old women, on this same long afternoon, in other great houses across the countryside. There is one in a stone manor in Gloucestershire, in a chair by her own window, looking out at her own old trees. There is one in a chateau in the Loire Valley, in a chair by her own window, looking out at her own old vineyards. There is one in a villa in the hills above Florence, in a chair by her own window, looking out at her own old olive trees. There is one in a castle on a long slope of Scottish hillside, in a chair by her own window, looking out at her own old stretch of moor. They are all, in a sense, the same woman. They are all, in another sense, 450 different women, each of whom has lived 450 different lives, in 450 different houses, with 450 different sets of trees and rooks and afternoon light. They do not mostly know about each other. They have not mostly met. A few of them have perhaps exchanged a few letters over the years, when one of them happened to be passing through the city where another of them happened to be staying. But they have not mostly formed a community. The great public arrangement that brought them across the ocean did not include, as one of its features, the keeping in touch of the women it sent. And yet they share something. They share the long crossing. They share the trousseau in the trunks. They share the day in the small side room with the glass of water, after the wedding. They share the first afternoon of tea in the unfamiliar drawing room. They share the slow learning of the house, the dogs, the gardens, the rooks. They share the long settling, the patient lowering of themselves into a country that was not theirs, until one day, without any particular announcement, the country simply was theirs, in the way a coat that has been worn for 50 years is the coat of the person wearing it, regardless of who originally bought it. They share also the late afternoons. They share the cup of tea held in two hands. They share the looking out the window at the old trees. They share the long quiet of a life that has, somewhere along the way, stopped being a question and become, instead, an answer. They are old. They are tired in a kind way. They are on this afternoon at peace. We can hold all of them, gently, for a long quiet moment in our minds. We do not have to know their names. We do not have to remember them as individuals. We can simply hold the soft shape of all of them together, sitting in their separate windows, in their separate countries, watching their separate trees, on this same slow late afternoon. They are well. They are mostly well. The story they have lived has folded around them, the way the great houses folded around them many years ago, and they are inside it now, and the inside is warm, and the light is soft, and the tea is good, and the afternoon has all the time it needs. When the long arrangement ended, it ended quietly. There was no single day on which it stopped. There was no headline, no proclamation. The First World War simply fell across the world like a great heavy curtain, and after it the houses on the avenue and the houses on the other side of the ocean were both, in different ways, less able to play the game they had been playing. The fortunes had shifted. The nobility had thinned. Many of the young men who would have been suitable husbands had died in trenches in France and Belgium between 1914 and 1918. Many of the great estates had been crippled by the new taxes that came in after the war. The whole shape of the older world, the world that the dollar princess phenomenon belonged to, had been rearranged in ways that no one in 1895 could have foreseen. The daughters who had crossed the ocean before the war went on living their lives. They raised their children. They managed their households as best they could in the new conditions. They aged. They became old women in the great houses they had once arrived at as girls. They watched their daughters and their daughters-in-law live very different lives, with shorter dresses and shorter hair, and shorter engagements, and a different kind of independence that was, in many ways, the indirect inheritance of the choices their mothers had made. The estates themselves changed. Many of the great country houses that had been kept up by American settlements at the turn of the century could not be kept up after the wars. They were sold to schools, to hospitals, to government offices, to careful preservation societies that turned them, over time, into museums. The dollar princesses in this sense had paid not only for the survival of those houses through one generation, but in many cases for their survival into the present. The roof that an American settlement repaired in 1892 is, in some cases, still the roof on the building today. The lead is the same lead. The slates are the same slates. The American girl whose father bought that roof has been dead for 60 years, and the roof is still there, and people walk through the rooms beneath it on Sunday afternoons, paying a few pounds each at the door, looking at the portraits of the old families and reading, on the small printed cards on the walls, the names of the women who, between them, kept the place from falling in. The American side, too, was changed. The houses on the avenue did not all survive. Many of them were torn down between the two wars and after, replaced by apartment buildings, by office towers, by department stores. The bedrooms with the silver-backed brushes, the upper sitting rooms with the long tables of silk, the breakfast rooms with the sideboards of warm dishes, all became, in time, lobbies, and elevator banks, and storage rooms and floors of corporate cubicles. The avenue itself, of course, is still there. The trees in the park are still there, although they are a different generation of trees now. The mornings still come up grey over the city, and the air still smells, in autumn, of damp leaves and something faintly metallic from the streets. The fortunes that funded the settlements were, in many cases, divided and redivided across generations. The descendants of the great families on both sides of the ocean are, today, mostly ordinary people, with ordinary jobs, in ordinary cities, who carry old surnames and very few of the original assets. The story of the dollar princesses is, for them, a family story rather than a current arrangement. A great-great-grandmother who was a duchess. A great-great-grandfather who paid for her to be one. A house in Wiltshire, sold long ago that the family no longer owns. A portrait somewhere that hangs in a museum. What remains, more than anything else, is the texture of those lives, preserved in letters and diaries and photographs and the occasional novel. The novels, in particular, have done a great deal of the work of keeping the story alive. The American writer Edith Wharton, who was a contemporary of those daughters and who knew many of them by name, wrote about that world in a way that has lasted. The English writers who came after, looking back at the decades before their own time, returned to it again and again. The French and the Italians, in their own languages, did the same. The world of the dollar princesses is in many ways a literary world now as much as a historical one. It exists in books on shelves. It exists in films, sometimes made many years later, in which a young actress in a long gown walks up an aisle of a cathedral with a man in a coronet. It exists in family photographs in a few old albums, in the small tender postures of women whose names are barely legible on the back of the prints. What was carried forward, beyond the houses and the fortunes, was something more diffuse. There is a particular sensibility, a particular way of being in the world, that came out of those marriages, a way of moving between countries, a way of speaking more than one language, a way of belonging to several places at once and to none of them entirely. The descendants of those marriages in our own time are scattered across the world. They are British and American and French and Italian and Argentine and Australian. They are in some sense a small living trace of a larger movement, in which a few hundred young women, between 1870 and 1914, were carried across an ocean and quietly knit two old worlds together. Whether that knitting was good or bad is not really the right question. It was, in many of its parts, painful. It was, in many of its parts, generous. It was, in some of its parts, openly transactional, and in other parts, deeply tender. It produced lasting marriages and unhappy ones, devoted children and estranged ones, beautiful old houses and bankrupt ones. It is the kind of long story that does not yield to a single judgment. It is the kind of long story that yields instead to a long quiet looking, in which one notices the texture of the days, the smell of the breakfast rooms, the sound of the rooks at evening, the faces in the photographs, and one allows the whole thing to be, in its complicated way, what it was. The daughters themselves in the photographs look out at us with various expressions. Some look proud, some look tired, some look, very faintly, amused. Some look serious in the way that young women in formal portraits in the 1890s were trained to look serious, with the chin lifted slightly and the eyes fixed on a point a little above the camera. Some look, in the candid photographs that survive in family albums rather than in newspapers, simply happy. Standing on a lawn in a pale summer dress with a dog at their feet, with a child holding their hand with a particular slant of summer light falling across the grass behind them. It is good, perhaps, to end on those candid photographs. The lawn, the dog, the child, the slant of summer light. They are not the public version of the story. They are the private version. They are the version that the newspapers, with their cartoons and their phrases about mineral deposits and export tariffs, never quite managed to capture. They are the version that survived the parties, that survived the cathedrals, that survived the long, quiet afternoons in the drawing rooms with the unfamiliar tea. In the candid photographs, the daughters are simply themselves. They are women in their 30s and 40s and 50s, in their own gardens, on their own lawns, with their own families around them, on a particular afternoon many decades ago. The arrangement that brought them to those gardens has dissolved into the past. The newspapers have moved on. The cartoons have been folded into archives. The settlements have been spent or invested or lost. What remains in those photographs is a woman in a pale dress, looking for a moment at the person holding the camera and smiling a small, real, unposed smile, while a child holds her hand and a dog lies at her feet, and the summer light falls softly across the grass. We can let the photographs be the last thing. We can let them sit in their old albums, on their old pages, in their slightly faded shades of brown and grey, and we can let the women in them rest, at last, inside the long quiet of the world that came after them. Let us linger just a little longer in one of those photographs. It is a photograph that was taken on a particular afternoon in 1910 or 1911 in the gardens of a particular country house in the south of England. The woman in the photograph is in her late 30s. She's wearing a pale linen dress. She's sitting on a wooden bench beneath a particular old oak tree. There is a small dog at her feet, looking up at her with the patient attention small dogs reserve for the people they have decided are theirs. There is a child, perhaps 8 years old, leaning gently against the side of the bench, with one small hand resting on his mother's arm. The woman is looking at the camera with a small, unposed smile. She's not posing exactly. She has been caught by whoever was holding the camera in a moment when she was not thinking about being photographed. The light is the soft, late afternoon light of an English summer, slanting through the leaves of the oak tree, falling in small bright patches across her dress and across the child's hair and across the dog's back. She came across the ocean 20 years before this photograph. She arrived in this country at the age of 17. She married, at 18, a man she had met 3 times. She moved into this house, where she has now been living for 19 years. She has had 3 children, of whom this is the youngest. She has buried one infant in the family chapel down the hill from the house. She has, over the past 19 years, become a person she could not quite have imagined being when she stood at the window of her bedroom on the avenue in 1895, watching the lamplighter make his rounds. All of this is held in some way in the photograph. None of it is visible. The photograph shows only a woman in a pale dress on a bench under a tree, with a small dog and a small child in the soft late afternoon light. But the long shape of her life is there, somewhere underneath the surface of the image, the way the long shape of a river is there underneath the surface of any single moment of its flowing. The photograph has survived. It is in a family album in the possession of a great-grandchild, in a city the woman in the photograph never visited, and would not, perhaps, have been able to find on a map. The album sits on a shelf in a quiet living room. It is taken down occasionally on rainy Sunday afternoons, and turned through carefully by people who feel a faint, distant connection to the woman in the pale dress. They look at her face, They look at the child's hand on her arm. They look at the dog at her feet. They turn the page. She does not mind. She has been past minding for a very long time. The photograph is what is left, and the photograph is enough. We can let it be enough. We can close the album gently and put it back on the shelf. We can leave the small living room. We can walk out into our own quiet evening, with whatever weather we have, with whatever lights are on in whatever rooms we live in, with whatever cup is in our own hands. We can carry the photograph with us, somewhere underneath everything else, the way we carry many small images of many people we have never met, who lived their lives in countries we have never visited, in years before we were born, and who left. Behind them, only the small patient evidence of their existence in the quiet pages of a family album somewhere. The photograph is enough. The afternoon was enough. The life in its long unfolding was enough. We can rest now, with all of it held softly in the warm dark of a quiet evening, while the city outside our own window does whatever it is doing, and the sounds of our own night come gently in from wherever they come from, and the pillow beneath our head is cool and patient and ready to hold us, the way the great houses once held their American brides, into whatever sleep is waiting. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. Somewhere in New York, on a slow grey morning in the autumn of 1895, a young woman is sitting at the edge of a tall window. The avenue below has gone quiet again, the way avenues go quiet at the very end of a day, with the last carriages already turned in for the night, with the lamplighter making his rounds in reverse, lifting his pole this time to coax the gas flames awake, one by one, into their soft yellow blooms. The kitchen, far below, is still. The clock in the hall is slowed to its evening rhythm, ticking gently to itself with no one to hear it but the cat on the rug. The fires in the family rooms have burned down to coals, glowing faintly in the dark grates, throwing small, soft shadows on the rugs. The newspapers from the morning have been folded and put away. The silver-backed brushes have been laid back in their careful row on the vanity table. The young woman has been called several times to come down for the evening meal, and she will go in a moment. But for now she rests her cheek against the cold pane of the window and watches the lamplighter make his slow, patient way along the street. The flames bloom one after another in his wake, small and warm and unhurried. The avenue, for a few minutes, becomes a long line of quiet yellow lights, leading away into the soft dark, past the trees in the park, past the rooftops, past the city, past everything she has ever known. She will turn from the window in a moment. She will go down to dinner. She will live the long shape of her life as it has been arranged for her, and as she will,